Hey there guys, this is Richard, your host, with another marvelous video. In this world, is the destiny of mankind controlled by some transcendental entity or law? Is it like the hand of God hovering above? At least it's true that man has no control, even over his own will. Man takes up the sword in order to shield the small wound in his heart sustained in a far-off time beyond remembrance. Man wields the sword so that he may die smiling in some far-off time beyond perception. It's insane how relevant these iconic opening words from the first numbered chapter of Berserk remain to the series, even to this day. After getting nearly 400 chapters of the late great Kentaro Miura's iconic masterpiece, we know it's true that the blind sheep populating this world have no control over their lives. It all flows according to the will of causality. Yes, it's like the hand of God is guiding these sheep, both black and white, to their doom, because the God hand has been manipulating world events for centuries, precisely in order to create the current circumstances. Nothing is in control of the average man. But then that isn't the man Miura refers to when he speaks of wielding a sword to a shield, a wound sustained in a far-off place beyond the human perception of time and space. For the rest, free will might just be a mythical concept, but if there's one human that's always struggled against the tide of what fate has in store for him, it's Guts, the Black Swordsman, the branded one, the foe of the Inhumans, part 2. Ever since he was born, Guts has been clinging to life like a drowning sailor holding onto a floating barrel for dear life. He's fought for his right to live since he was a child, and that hasn't changed a lot since he became an adult. In fact, if anything, it's gotten worse because of the circumstances that Guts lives under. He's a man on a mission, a man on the warpath against evil entities that transcend human perception. His life story is an unintentional record of the human struggle against blind faith and submission to the tide of fate, and in this video, we're going to explore all of it. We'll be talking in excruciating detail about Guts' entire life up until this point in the story, and by this point, we mean chapter 375. If Studio Gaga announces the next chapter tomorrow, we'll look like right idiots, but that's a risk we're willing to take. So, grab your popcorn, get comfy in your work chairs, hit that AC or heater if you're in your car somewhere, because this will be a long one. This is the entire life of Guts explored. He was seen as a cursed child since birth. How Guts came into this world. We often hear people say that you are what you make of yourself, and while that is true, the circumstances of one's birth can't be discounted from the narrative. How you were born, where you came into this world, why. It all gives life meaning, and that's doubly the case in dark fantasy tales like Berserk. Though it's not a big or direct focus of the series, it's been implied several times that the birth of a character and the circumstances surrounding it is what has shaped them into what they are today. Paranase has become a powerful mage because she shed her life of nobility and false faith, discovering a new, more authentic personal foundation through magic. Serpico's tied to her story because he's her half-brother, though she doesn't know it, and he'd like to keep it that way. He's been able to come so far as a magical warrior because of his inherently cooperative nature, which has been cultivated through a childhood of hardship and harsh experiences. Casca was born the youngest child of a poor family in an even poorer town. She was sold because she was disposable, and she found meaning through becoming a Falcon. All these characters overcame their birth circumstances and didn't allow it to shape who they are in life, but when we see them at their lowest moments, we can't help but be reminded of these things. Guts is a little different from them because while he too overcame the severity of his birth circumstances, his birth itself was, special, in a very dark, dance macabre sort of way. For you see, Guts wasn't even supposed to survive. The very first scene we see of Guts' life from a canonical perspective is his birth, and it's horrifying to say the least. A group of mercenaries likely marching from one battlefield to another come across a tree whose leaves aren't green. They're varying shades of brown and red. This isn't because it's fall season, it's because the leaves are hanged corpses. A dozen of them, all robed in varying stages of decay, with ravens pecking at the flesh and hanging around the tree. It's an ominous scene that seems ripped straight out of a Salem witch management handbook from the 1600s, but perhaps that's intentional, because the corpses share some curious similarities. All of them have the same robes on, and all of them have long shoulder-length hair and body frames that suggest they're women. This tree was a tree used to hang suspected witches, no doubt, and while that sounds like superstition at first to any adherent of the Holy See, we now know that the existence of witches is a universal truth. One of our protagonist's current companions is the witch Shirka, who would have likely suffered a fate similar to these women had she been caught by the people who hanged them. Unfortunately, the mercenaries were adherents of the former school of thought. So when they came across the tree, even as men who lived to spill their enemies' blood, they were unnerved. The more superstitious of the bunch wanted to make their destination without lingering around the place for too long, but that was made impossible by one of the members of the party, a woman named Shizu. Shizu was the lover of the party's leader, a mercenary called Gambino, who was as shrewd in battle as he was selfish in life. The woman had lost her sanity due to an unfortunate miscarriage she suffered shortly before the mercenary's current deployment, and that was made evident in the way Miura drew her. But it was when she reached out towards one of the corpses, or rather what was underneath it, that the catalyst event of our story takes place. But underneath one of the hanged corpses, covered in the mire of afterbirth, blood and mud, lay a child. The mercenaries had seen the kid as well, but made no move to collect it or even bury it. They just wanted to move on. But Shizu leapt at the babe as if it were her own, motivated perhaps by her fresh trauma. The boy showed no sign of life at first. When the group spotted him, he was lying there, unmoving. He didn't even react to Shizu picking him up. It was after Gambino tried to pull her away from it, where she dropped him in a puddle, that it showed signs of life. It started bawling its eyes out, crying so hard it felt as though the world itself were weeping, until Shizu broke out of Gambino's hold and took the boy in her arms again. She gave the man one distasteful look and fled to the back of the line, getting cozy in a wagon with her newfound child, who looked all too content now that he had a mother. Gambino's men tried to get him to get Shizu to leave the kid, because they were superstitious men who thought finding a baby at death's door under a witch-hanging tree was a bad omen. But Gambino couldn't care any less. He didn't even care about Shizu's miscarriage, and all he saw was an opportunity for her to console herself with a toy that was likely to die anyway. He let her keep the kid and kept the party moving, but glanced back at the tree, repeating his men's words about the kid back to himself. Little did he know he was planting the seeds of hatred in his own mind. Because he was born from a corpse and had a piece of his mother's umbilical cord attached to him, his new mother named the baby Guts, which is rather fitting considering the man he goes on to become. Guts was born with no clue about his birth father or mother's identities. He was born from death. As it is possible, his mother was hanged while he was within her womb, and he came into the world with no one to tend to his arrival. Children born in this manner don't usually survive, but Guts did, thanks to Shizu and his own, well, guts. Despite having a petite stature, the child was unnaturally vital and managed to live beyond Gambino's expectations. Any normal child would have died, being found in that condition. We have no idea how long Guts had been lying in the mud. After all, it could have been a few minutes, a few hours, or even a few days. The mercenaries of Gambino's group were experienced at creating dead bodies. They'd seen death in most of its many forms, and they were certain the child was dead. That it came back to life was a sign that it would go on to struggle against some of the biggest controlling forces of this world, as pointed by his fellow struggler. People like to say that Guts' birth has no bearing on how the story plays out, but we'd like to counter that by saying one of the most prophetically accurate characters in the series specifically points it out as one of the core reasons that he'll be able to survive the biggest turning point in his life. We'll get into both of those things in detail later on, but we wanted to mention it here because it's an important characteristic of Guts' personality, the struggle to live and survive, despite thinking about not wanting to. Sure, his mother might not be a witch, and he might not have magical powers himself, but the way he survived the jaws of death is what's important here, because it shows you how Guts has always fought for his life from the very beginning. He'd go on to have a brief relationship with his step-parents, well, mostly his step-mum, because Gambino was too busy fighting and not acknowledging his relationship with Shizu. 3 years passed as that cursed babe grew up into a cursed infant, but tragedy wasn't far behind him, because Guts lost his second mother as soon as he was able to begin comprehending things. The life of a mercenary is tough, but in certain aspects, the life of a camp follower is even worse. While the men are off fighting, the women are exposed to things like disease, the threat of sexual violence, and worse things. Shizu fell victim to one of the many threats wartime camp followers come into contact with, the plague. She was in the final stages of the disease too, so the nurses attending to her wanted Guts to be nowhere near her. They voiced their frustration with Gambino, who was off besieging a castle, and told the kid he'd get infected as well if he stuck around too long. But Guts' strong desire to stay with his mother made him walk towards her. He'd known only one comforting presence in his life, and it was her. So in her final moments, he wanted to return the favor. Guts grabbed Shizu's outstretched palm with his own and sat with her through the night as she passed into the final sleep. He remained unaffected by the plague's contagiousness, likely because of that vitality we mentioned a few moments ago, but maybe dying would have been a better option for him, because what followed after wasn't a series of tough life lessons, it was just straight up plain old abuse. The traumas of growing up in the middle of war, Guts' abusive childhood. The next time we catch up with the future Black Swordsman is in the middle of a battlefield, which is fitting considering he spent most of his life at war, but horrifying when you consider Guts was just 6 years old at the time. In the 3 years following Shizu's death, Gambino had decided to let her adopted plaything live, in exchange for servitude, of course. Gambino had come to the conclusion that the only way to make Shizu's pesky little bastard work off his debt was to make him his errand boy. And so, the mercenary leader took a 6-year-old child into the front lines of what looks to be a siege battle. Gambino was in a heated exchange with the enemy. His crossbow unit was struggling against their charge, and Gambino knew he had to switch from ranged to melee combat. He asked Guts, who was bafflingly enough at the front lines with him, to hand him a spear. Guts, being a child of course, was a little hesitant in doing so because it was his first time seeing real battlefield action. Such sights could leave grown men traumatized, so you can imagine the effect it was having on this little kid. Gambino didn't care though. As far as he was concerned, he was Guts' provider, and the provided had to earn his provisions. He yanked the spear out of Guts' hands, intercepted an oncoming cavalryman with it, and things played out in such a way that the enemy soldier's gutted corpse fell on top of Guts. Forget being crushed by the weight of an adult male in full armor. This was a 6-year-old witnessing brutal, self-serving, survival-based killing for the first time. Guts was overcome with emotions, but Gambino was clear on what he was feeling. Rage. He smacked Guts with the butt of the spear so hard he knocked a tooth out of his jaw and chastised him for trying to get him killed. If anything, it feels like Gambino is the one trying to get Guts killed by taking him to war at such a young age, and his subsequent actions tally up with this assessment. After seeing Guts' abysmal performance, Gambino decides to train the boy. He begins sparring with Guts in order to teach the boy how to earn his bread proper. The lad is barely managing to land a strike at the much larger mercenary and struggling harder when parrying his blows. Gambino is making a show out of the matchup for his men. He unceremoniously kicks Guts square in the guts after swatting aside his measly strikes, which is rightfully called out as going too far by one of his comrades. Gambino reminds him that they're mercenaries, and Guts is gonna have to work his ass off if he's gonna survive with this band right here. Another mercenary agrees with the mercenary argument, but can't understand why Guts insists on fighting with a sword that's double his size. The defiant young man vehemently rejects his suggestion of sizing down his weapon, and the merc thinks Guts is pig-headed out loud. Gambino chimes in by saying they don't keep kid-sized weapons anyway, and this is how the protagonist of Berserk came to be adept at wielding swords much larger than him. It was drilled into him from the beginning. While it's true that handling a standard longsword is a pipe dream for most 6-year-olds, Guts isn't most 6-year-olds. He's determined to prove his worth with the sword and to Gambino as well, so he rallies himself and charges in for another round. The crowd is amused by his courage and they start cheering him on, but Gambino still isn't taking things too seriously. He blocks Guts' incoming strike and retaliates with a brutal series of cuts that leave the kid bleeding from half a dozen places. But something changes within the boy in that moment. Guts looks angry, almost offended at being caught out like that, so he rushes in, closes the gap between them, and thrusts his sword upwards, scoring a clean hit on Gambino's chin. It's like some sort of animal took over him in that moment and activated his fight response, because when Guts realized what he'd done, he became afraid. Gambino was irate. He called Guts a runt and slashed his nose so deep it cut through his bone, giving him the iconic scar we all know and love. His fellow mercs finally took the calling out of Gambino's brash training seriously and start taking the injured Guts to the medic tent. One of them rhetorically asks him if that wasn't a bit childish on his part, and Gambino agrees that he got a bit carried away, but the rage doesn't leave his eyes. That night, as he's convalescing, Guts overhears some of the mercs talking about how long Gambino was going to keep him around and stuff. Mercenaries are a superstitious bunch, and Gambino's men especially, like we told you guys earlier. They might have helped him survive a fatal situation, but they didn't like the fact that a kid like him, born from a dead mother, was still traveling with them. Guts was still a cursed child and an ill omen to them, so they blamed his second mother's death on him, claiming Shizu must have gotten the plague because of him. Guts was already in terrible shape. He could barely breathe because of the blood clogging his cut-through nose. He was burning up from a fever, and now he had to hear this. The only thing that gave him comfort in this moment was his sword, which he grabbed onto like a pillow, and only then could he sleep. The next day, we see Guts take a detour from his squirrely duties of fetching water for the band to begin his daily ritual of swinging his sword 100 times so he can get used to its weight and balance. This 6-year-old kid is bloodying his hands, thinking that it's only when he swings a sword that he doesn't have to think about anything else, and this is depressing. It's clear that Guts' motivation to train here is, well, yeah, to get stronger, but more importantly, to become useful. He was an extremely perceptive and intelligent person even as a child, and he knew that if he didn't pull his weight around here soon enough, he wouldn't have a life to cling to. He took such a long time practicing that Gambino had to come looking for him, and even he was taken aback by Guts' dedication momentarily. He takes one look at what's going on, throws him a pouch of medicine for his wounds, and tells him to hurry up with his meal. He goes to to walk away, but stops when Guts thanks him, only to hear him out, dismiss him, and distance himself regardless. The boy takes the medicine and, in a sheepish manner, applies it to his nose as we see the narration tell us that perhaps Gambino did this solely to soothe his own guilty conscience. We suspect that's bang on the money, because he's shown time and again that all he cares about is himself. He's training Guts to make him his own lapdog, not to train a protege. He probably gave him the medicine because he saw that the kid was putting in the work, so there was use for him on the battlefield yet. But to Guts, this became a fatherly gesture, something he'd hold on to for many years, regardless of knowing Gambino's true motivations. Guts had come to see Gambino as a tough yet ultimately right kind of father figure, and this is where he made a major error. Though, to be fair to him, he was extremely young and probably didn't even know the word exploitation, let alone understand its meaning. 3 years later, at the age of 9, Guts became a part of his first deployment. It was a castle siege, and as usual, his force was storming the place. Gambino entreated Guts to work hard for his pay, as this was his first fight, and Guts took those words to heart. He got to work and almost immediately scored a kill, but because it was his first proper kill in combat, it stunned him. He didn't have the time to show such hesitation though, because another defender showed up and smacked Guts with a mace. The kid was on his back and would surely have died had Gambino not intervened. He killed the mace wielder and told Guts to keep moving after scoring a kill, because unlike training, there were no pauses during real combat. To Gambino, this was likely an act of asset preservation. He didn't want to lose a soldier at any cost, so he saved Guts when he could. But to Guts, Gambino saved his life. When he got his pay from the band's accountant at the end of the fight, he gave all of it to Gambino, who tossed him a single coin for his good effort. He offhandedly told him to keep it up, and Guts was so overcome with this acknowledgement of his skills that he profoundly proclaimed that he would. The boy walked away, tossing his coin off his fingers and feeling loved by someone he thought was his parent. But to Gambino, this wasn't even remotely affectionate. He just gave a good dog a scrap to play with. He grabbed a working girl by the arm even before his conversation with Guts ended, and it was when another man called Donovan from his crew approached him about something that the true depth of his revolting nature revealed itself. That night, Guts was lying in his tent, shivering, thinking to himself that he always got anxious around this time. Of course, we know that it's because he's subconsciously aware of the fact that people are out to get him, and nighttime in a merc camp is the breeding ground for all sorts of misfortunes. But since he was a child, his mind couldn't fully comprehend the signals his body was sending to him. Maybe that's why when Donovan entered his tent, Guts knew why he was there, but couldn't believe who had sent him. The child warrior wasn't exactly friends with a lot of people in the band, so he instinctively knew that Donovan was here to do something bad to him, given the hour. When the big bald man tries to grab Guts, he fights back, elbowing him in the face and giving him a groin-shaking kick for good measure. But it wasn't enough. Donovan simply smacked him onto a trunk of clothes and lifted the helpless child up by his throat. He acknowledged that Guts fought like a wildcat, but Donovan had been a mercenary for years, and he knew ways besides physical violence to break his targets. The moment he revealed that Gambino had sold Guts out to him for 3 silver coins, Guts' body went limp. His disbelief made him stop resisting, and at the tender age of 9, he was raped. The boy endured the harrowing ordeal, not believing a word of what Donovan said to him, and by the morning, he was like a hollow shell of himself. Gambino was just chilling. The mercenary leader broke his morning by giving himself a shave with a knife. He was so casual about Guts approaching him with a sword and a blank look that it made the kid doubt what Donovan had said. Gambino told him to put the breakfast on, and his expression was so unbothered that Guts thought he'd made a mistake by thinking his father was guilty. He decided to find out the truth from a position of strength, so during their next assault, Guts isolated Donovan and shot him in the back with a crossbow bolt. The projectile went straight through his chest, so there was no chance of him surviving. Guts rounded up on him like a wolf stalking prey and demanded Donovan tell him the name of the man that sold him out. Even as he was dying, he took Gambino's name, so Guts killed him before he could finish saying. He should have listened, because most of the time, brutes don't have a reason to lie, and the people we think care for us are really just using us instead. Later on, during the same mission, as Gambino's band was assaulting the enemy castle, they retaliated with a barrage of cannon fire, and the mercenary leader got caught in the crossfire. He ended up losing his leg because of it, which put him out of commission as the head of the group. The other mercs had already started discussing replacements for him when Guts walked into the tent, and they kept talking about it as they left, but he stayed. As he saw Gambino squirming in his tent with a missing leg, Guts thought about how that man had always looked down on him. Gambino acted high and mighty, selfish, cold, always smiling that disdainful smile that just told you he thinks you're lesser than him. A part of Guts was happy this happened because he was aware of all the abuse Gambino had put him through. But then he saw Gambino reaching out for a hand and calling out to Shizu in his fever dreams, and he broke. Despite his disgusting behavior, Gambino was still a father figure to him, and Guts couldn't take seeing him like this. He started crying, claiming this wasn't like Gambino at all, the hard mercenary that won battles no matter the cost. The young warrior couldn't accept that his idol was human after all, but perhaps he should should have. It would have saved him the pain that was yet to come, and also made him realize that his father figure didn't see him as a human being at all, but rather an annoying mutt that followed him around like a gnat. Now that Gambino had lost the ability to fight and been replaced as leader, he was subject to the ridicule of his fellow mercenaries, and he only had time to think about his own woes. 2 years later, at the age of 11, Guts was taking down enemy generals like a seasoned vet, while Gambino was busy playing vet to a puppy back at the camp. When the kid returned with the bonus for killing the general, Gambino's first thought wasn't women or wine. Like Guts was suggesting he could go looking for, it was to get meat for the dog. It surprised Guts too, so Gambino smacked him with his crutch to make him understand what he meant. Guts left that place frustrated with the fact that no matter what he seemed to do, Gambino gave the damn dog more attention and courtesy than him. He excused this in his own head by resolving to do better and kill more enemies the next morning. But Guts didn't know just how close he was to understanding Gambino's perception of himself. After Guts departed, Gambino kicked the puppy away and became standoffish with his former fighting peers. He stormed off to get himself some peace, but the puppy followed him wherever he went, just like Guts, he thought. That night, as Guts was about to go to sleep, Gambino entered his tent drunk and with a sword in his hand. He started swinging for the boy as best as he could, and out came his true feelings in a torrent of malice and hate. Gambino admitted that he'd made a mistake. His mistake was to keep Guts with him even after being told off by so many of his men on so many occasions. The former mercenary leader had become delirious because of his hopelessness as an invalid. He was using alcohol as a coping mechanism, and that kind of thing usually has a pretty low dam. It broke this night, and he finally admitted that his comrades were right. Guts was a cursed child. He could finally see that the cause for all his misfortunes was his kid, right here. He blamed him for Shizu's death, for his own injury, despite knowing full well Guts was nowhere near being responsible for that. He admitted that he was the one who sold Guts to Donovan, and that he'd indirectly tried to get him killed many times. Gambino said he wished Guts died underneath the tree Shizu picked him up from, and this all feels like a falsehood to Guts, but it's the bitter truth. Gambino was blaming this 11-year-old boy for all of his life's problems and was about to kill him for it, and Guts would have probably died too had his body not been so good at defending itself. He instinctively dodges Gambino's sloppy strikes and kills him with a counterattack that goes through the big man's throat. With his father's dead body crumbled on top of him and his tent catching fire, Guts has enough sense to escape the encampment because he knew he would get hunted down. Sure enough, a short while after he nicks a horse from the stables, he's followed by Gambino's men, who were more livid than ever with his actions, especially because in their head they could have avoided it. They showered him with a barrage of arrows, and one of them goes through Guts' chest, just missing his heart and vital organs. The kid falls off of his horse and down a steep cliff, where the other guys are sure he couldn't survive, but not satisfied with his death, because Gambino can't rest in peace now. As for Guts himself, he realizes that even though his mind doesn't want to continue living, his body for some reason does. He not only survived a fatal fall with only 2 broken ribs, he also fended off a wolf pack attack whilst dizzy from all his lost blood, and he did all of this on autopilot. Eventually, he passed out from his wounds and was found by another mercenary group that took him in as a prospective replacement, but the real damage had been done already. Donovan's assault, Gambino's betrayal, and his generally rough upbringing turned Guts into a sour and withdrawn teenager with a serious PTSD reflex. Try touching him if you fancy losing an arm. This 11-year-old boy was forced to go into survival of the fittest mode because of things that were out of his control, and for the next 4 years, he traveled from one battlefield to another with a single goal: to survive for the next day. It was in this maelstrom of emotions that he came across the man that would change his life for better and worse: Griffith, the lone wolf and the white falcon. How Guts met Griffith and became the Falcon's raider captain. After waking up from being rescued, Guts likely stuck with the mercenary band that picked him up out of a sense of gratitude for a little while. But we say only a little while because we know that he ends up becoming a solo mercenary in the years leading up to his introduction to Griffith. It makes sense, considering all the horrors he was forced to go through. Guts can't trust anyone but himself, and anything but his sword. Because of Donovan, whenever someone tries to touch him without his permission, he lashes out at them and screams at them to not touch him. The reaction is worse if it's a man, for reasons that should be obvious. And apart from his trauma, another thing that Guts doesn't let go of is his perception of Gambino as a pseudo-father figure, which is highlighted in the Spring Flowers of Distant Days trilogy of chapters. Though he knows he acted out of self-defense, Guts still feels guilty about killing Gambino, because he felt as though he owed a lot of who he is to the man. Case in point, what happened when Guts met another elderly mercenary called Martino. 4 years had passed since Gambino's death at this point, and Guts was now nearly a man grown. As such, when he was taken prisoner, He was treated like a man as well, which meant stocks and shackles became familiar accessories for him soon enough. It was during one such moment, as he was being herded toward the castle of the enemy lord, that Guts met Martino. He was an old man who seemed interested in helping out Guts in the beginning, but hoodwinked him with his sweet talk of hoping the kid didn't end up like him and found friends someday in order to escape himself. Guts was shot down and thrown in the prison of the castle, where he dreamed of a time Gambino did something similar to him. One time, Gambino added Guts to a force of decoys that were meant to be fodder for his enemy's arrows. Guts was the sole survivor. Everyone else died. After that happened, Gambino sent in the rest of his boys to clean up the scene, and when he saw Guts, he gave him some fatherly advice that in order to survive on a battlefield, people had to do despicable things. Of course, in reality, Gambino was likely just trying to get Guts killed by accident to absolve himself of the blame, but then again, the boy would never look at it that way. When he woke up, he realized that lesson was not one he learnt well, because clearly, Martino used his kindness to dupe him as well. Maybe it was because he was in such a delirious state thanks to the injuries he sustained that he started seeing a small fairy-like creature in his prison cell. But Guts wasn't seeing things. This flower spirit was called Chich, and she was the first astral creature that Guts met from a canonical perspective. Chich didn't know much of the spoken language and named herself after the noises the rats that scurried about the cell made. So you can tell that she wasn't the brightest crayon in the box. But she was determined, and once she surmised that Guts was a human in need of help, she got to work healing him. Guts was half fever dreaming, so he played around with Chich, not really taking her seriously, until he woke up the next morning, fully healed, and found Chich's flower withered and wilted. He was confused about whether she was a dream or not, but he knew he'd promised to take her to a field outside the castle where flowers similar to hers grew. So he decided that, hallucination or no, he would keep his promise. When the Lord came for Guts, he only had one request for him: to be a killing dummy for his own brutish son. Guts accepted because he knew he could outdo whoever they put in front of him, but his appalling gear did get in the way. Still, he got the noble's fat bastard of a son hostage and was about to escape when, surprise, surprise, Martino returns. Turns out he went and got the whole crew with him, not to save Guts or anything, but to jump them when their guard was down. Guts simply visits the flower field, bids farewell to the spirit that saved him, and moves on to his next target, the one where his path with his greatest inspiration and nemesis converges. During what felt like a routine siege, Guts came across one of his biggest opponents yet, at least from a physical standpoint. Called Berserker the Grey Knight, this behemoth of a man wielded a giant battle axe and was known as the 30-Man Slayer, because he once killed 30 men all by himself. He was also rumored to have killed a bear by his lonesome too, so he was a dangerous presence that Guts' campaign sponsor was all too eager to get rid of. Where no grown man dared to step, Guts strode. He challenged Berserker to a one-on-one fight and was ridiculed by every man there, even those technically on his side. They thought the kid just wanted to show off his fancy two-handed greatsword, which was about as tall as him. But once he started moving, everyone shut up and started paying attention. Guts had always been an unnatural adept fighter, but his skills were far beyond his 15 years of age. He instinctively went for Berserker's weapon, knowing that was what he needed to neutralize first. His flurry of attacks were so quick and precise that it pushed back the seemingly immovable Berserker, shocking every man in attendance. When Berserker tried to counter, Guts parried and cracked his battle axe, which gave him the winning edge over the much larger knight. By this point, the young swordsman had figured out a killing strategy. He was going to slash through Berserker's waist and then smash his head in. He went in for the first step, and Berserker nearly caught him with a blow that should have decapitated him. But because Guts had already cracked his weapon, Berserker's axe broke upon making contact with his helmet, and Guts was able to follow through on his plan with sickening ease. He collected his 7 pieces of gold and went off on his merry way, unaware that he'd just been scouted by a group that would change his life forever. The castle Guts' group was besieging was only supposed to be a 2-week job. It turned into a weeks-long battle, because not only did the enemies have formidable soldiers like Berserker on their team, they were also the infamous undefeated band of the Falcon, led by the White Falcon Griffith. Guts was unaware of this fact when he killed Berserker, and he was also unaware of his performance impressing Falcons like Griffith and Judo. But fate has a funny way of working itself out the way it's supposed to. And so it was that after leaving the siege, Guts was spotted by the more rogue elements of the band of the Falcon all alone on the road. The guy who spotted him, Caucus, would go on to become one of his biggest detractors in the series because, well, 1. Caucus is a certified hater, and 2. Guts does kill his friends, no matter who instigated that fight. Under the pretext of avenging Berserker, Caucus tried to jump Guts and steal his bonus with 3 other guys, but soon lost 2 of them, realizing he'd messed with a force much powerful than him. He would have killed the rest as well, had a female warrior not stepped in. The second best swordsman of the Falcons, she was able to hold off Guts for a short while, but a short while only. Still, this was how Guts and Casca met, And it's fitting considering how their relationship unfolds. But it's when Guts takes out his best fighter that the leader of the Falcon steps into the picture, and for the first time in his life, Guts is completely outperformed in every aspect of battle. You should check out our detailed video on Guts vs Griffith, which is up on our channel for more details on their fights themselves. But suffice it to say that the White Falcon was leagues above Guts as a swordsman at this point in the story. Yeah, Guts had been through a lot and survived a lot with the strength of his sword alone. His technique with large weapons was unmatched, and the fact that he has to hold on to his sword to even sleep properly, a habit he carries into adulthood with him by the way, should tell you just how important battle is in his life. And yet, Griffith utterly outclasses him not once, but twice. The first time, you could say he had an advantage as he was armoured, and Guts wasn't. And Griffith was on horseback, which made his precise strike at Guts' vital point somehow easier for him. But then you have the second fight, where Griffith basically tosses aside Guts' greatsword like a toy when he parries, and his agility allows him to scale the length of Guts' blade as a flex. Not that way, you dirty mongrels. Griffith was just undeniably better at combat than him, and this frustrated Guts because he had to end up agreeing to something he never thought he would again. The first time he lost to Griffith, Guts chalked it up to a numbers disadvantage, but the second time was a fair fight, and he put his freedom on the line for it as well. When Griffith boldly declared that he wanted Guts, the swordsman told him he could do whatever he pleased with him if he defeated him, and then he did, which meant he now had to become Griffith's soldier. But becoming Griffith's soldier opened his eyes to the fact that he'd met a person who actually had the skills and balls to make big claims, and then make them come true. On his first night as a Falcon, Guts was assigned rear guard duty, but as he rode to the side of their raid, he couldn't help but marvel at Griffith's planning. The White Falcon had taken everything he possibly could into account while orchestrating this attack. The terrain they'd go through, the positions of their enemies, the wind patterns, all of it. Guts was thoroughly impressed by Griffith's foresight, so much so that when it came time for the retreat, he shouldered the responsibility of cutting off the enemy's chase all by himself. He even helped save the life of a fellow Falcon along the way, but after one point the sheer numbers game started catching up to him. Just when Guts was unhorsed and left to fend for himself against an oncoming horde, Griffith swooped back in to save him and defeat the pursuers by luring them toward cannon fire. Guts truly impressed everyone in the band of the Falcon, minus Caucus, of course, with his performance that day, considering there were scores of people following him, and Griffith earned his loyalty by coming out to save him like that. At a later time, he asks Griffith why he did that, and he's told that the Falcon didn't want to lose such an invaluable soldier that he just acquired, which should have been his first red flag, honestly, but we'll stay on topic here. The band of the Falcon truly changed Guts' life for the better, and Griffith played a huge part in it. Before, he was always the kid of the bunch, the weakest by default, and therefore easy prey by default. He'd spent 2/3 of his life on battlefields by 15, and that's depressing when you think about it, even for someone in a medieval setting. Having seen and been exposed to so much of the vices of an adult, Guts never really got to be a kid. And now, here he was, surrounded by people close to his age, being led by a guy who was that much older than him, and they all fought like beasts on the field but were thick as thieves outside of it. There was a rare sense of unlimited optimism about the future and complete faith in leadership within the band of the Falcons that Guts had never seen before in any mercenary band. For the first time in his life, he made friends. Judo, who welcomed him to the band, Pippin, who forced him to celebrate his first mission and tanked an elbow to the face from Guts for it, and young Rickert, the boy Guts saved during his first mission and the Falcon's residential weapons expert. And, for the first time in his life, Guts tried to find purpose beyond simply surviving. After their first battle together, Griffith and Guts had a conversation about why the latter was now in the former's band. Griffith flat out declared his ambition to seize a kingdom of his own, despite being a commoner, and Guts sat there and listened to his spiel. But more than that, the two bonded as though they were brothers. Their interaction began with a water war, and while Guts was impressed with Griffith's prowess as a leader, he also couldn't deny that he definitely felt childlike as well. And having seen the level of preparation he had for a single raid, Guts couldn't deny his talent. Besides, he now belonged to Griffith, which again was a massive red flag, but for now, Guts was okay with serving a cause bigger than himself, because it was his first time doing such a thing. In the final few pages of the Golden Age Arc's prelude chapters, Guts thinks of what he's been doing with life while Griffith has already found such ambitions. He questions where he's headed, and asks Gambino for an answer. Rickert answers instead by informing him that his first day on the job had worked out better than anyone expected. Guts had been promoted to Raiders captain. He'd have 10 men under his command, and over time, that number would only grow. Pippin joined in later, and Judo smiled at the scene unfolding in front of him, because he knew what Guts himself didn't realize at the time, that the swordsman was slowly but surely finding a home for himself with the Falcons. And the biggest factor in his decision to stay wasn't even positive companionship. No, it was welcome. It was Griffith himself. Guts was dazzled by the White Falcon's vision and his determination and talent to achieve it no matter the cost. That was why he made his peace with following Griffith. Over the course of the next 3 years of his life, Guts grew immeasurably as a warrior and unit captain, growing his squad to over the 100 Rickett had predicted he would soon have. He became such a killing machine that he could act as a decoy for an entire cavalry horde and still come out alive and having given his troops a significant advantage over the enemy. The raider captain's job is to create as much havoc as possible on the front lines, and Guts became a professional at that. But this didn't stop him from admiring Griffith. At one point in their association, after a particularly nasty skirmish, Griffith lifted up Guts from a mound of corpses of his creation, while marveling at his devil's luck. He mused about the controlled yet chaotic nature of war, how it felt as though things flowed at the mercy of an unseen tide, and explained to him his personal philosophy on life. He believed that irrespective of one's birth, class, or skill, there were a handful of people that made the world work the way it did. Those people were the true elites, and he wanted to know his place amongst them, confirm whether he belonged in that class. He wanted to know what he was destined for, and he claimed it was funny he was saying all this because it was his first time sharing his true thoughts with someone. At that time, Guts thought Griffith so bright, he felt noble and larger than life. That image of him carried the swordsman from blood-soaked, nameless battlefields into the court of Midland. He wasn't the type for politics, but even he couldn't deny the obvious impact Griffith had made on world politics by joining the 100 Years' War on Midland's side. His unbeatable strategies and undefeated streak soon made him the darling of the king and the subjects of Midland, and an enemy of every noble that abhorred the idea of a commoner joining their ranks. In the first numbered chapter of Berserk, Griffith was named Viscount, which meant he was now of peerage and could actually become a king if he played his cards right. Guts kept seeing the proof of Griffith's powers of manifestation firsthand, so he kept contributing to it as his closest confidant. For some reason, the White Falcon had subconsciously made Guts his right-hand man, and the man himself never shied away from what the job called for. If Griffith asked him to kidnap a nobleman's daughter, he did it. If he asked him to assassinate a political rival, he did that as well. Even though Guts felt disgusted with himself for doing so because a kid became collateral damage in the process, he did it nonetheless because he felt a kinship with Griffith. It would turn out to not be the case, but we'll get to that in a few minutes. For now, let's talk about the moment that broke Guts' perception of the world, Nosferatu Zod. The Immortal One strikes. The day that Guts' life changed forever. Before reaching the Tudor fortress that the band of the Falcon came across in Chapter 2 of Berserk, they'd never been halted in their tracks. Sure, they'd faced obstacles before. Guts kept them occupied in a siege that was supposed to last for 2 weeks, for 2 months. But this time was different. Guts' raider unit had spent hours trying to breach the inner walls of the castle, but no word had returned. 50 raiders had gone in and not come back outside. The raider captain was losing his cool. He wanted the head of the man that was treating his comrades like ants. His second-in-command, Gaston, could barely hold him back, but when one of his men came crawling back, on the verge of death with a single name on his lips, everything went to hell. Outside, Griffith was speculating as to what was causing the hold-up, and Judo brought up a rumor he'd heard on the wind that a man called Nosferatu Zod had joined Tudor's side. He was known as the battlefield god by mercenaries and also the Immortal One, because he had allegedly been active for over 100 years and was still in peak condition. Everyone knew Zod's name, or had heard rumors of it, except for Guts evidently, because he just strode inside the castle walls by himself, even after hearing that name. He was expecting to see corpses on his way in, but not so many, definitely not dealt with in this fashion. Many of his men had been mangled to death, as though they were mauled by some monstrous bear. Guts was baffled by the carnage, but he lost all courage when he saw its source. Standing in front of him, with 2 of his raiders dangling off his sword and a pile of their dead corpses behind him, was the man who would go on to become one of Guts' most iconic rivals, Zod, in full birthday suit, no less. You can check out our detailed breakdown of the rivalry in our Guts vs Nosferatu Zod video, because addressing everything here is not gonna work. This video is about Guts after all, but we will mention the 2 major ways in which it changed Guts' entire life. The first is his realization that he wasn't top dog in the fight game, not by a long shot. For the rest of the 100-Year War campaign, Guts fought with a chip on his shoulder because not only was he humbled by his loss to Zod, he was also humiliated by it. Zod made him feel fear unlike any other opponent, and it left a bitter taste in Guts' mouth that he would have preferred getting rid of by beating Adon Cobbervoltz's head in. But hey, such is life. We don't always get the things we want. Zod opened Guts' eyes to a new world of strength, and the fact that he wasn't even ranking in it, in a sense, made him irate. This neatly ties into his second realization, which is that something much bigger than himself is at play here, but he simply refuses to acknowledge it because of his nature. Guts is a man that paves his own path and never apologizes for his choices. He has free will, at least according to him. However, Zod's prophecy exposed him to a future that even he was uncertain he could face. The foreshadowing for the Eclipse is brilliantly handled in the series, and what it means for Guts' life even more so. That shot of Zod extending his wings and telling Guts that he'll soon be visited by an inescapable death is iconic for a reason. It's because it solidifies the concept of things like the astral world and causality within the lore of Berserk, and how Guts has always been resisting it. Even though these abstract ideas might get too complex in theory at times, they all lead to one practical solution for Guts, which is getting stronger. And this isn't all just because he wants to beat Zod, which is how we get to this next part of his story. The battles we fight for our own sake, Guts' legend as the 100-Man Slayer, and his departure from the band. In Chapter 12, Guts has a rather heartbreaking realization. He was in a one-sided relationship with this man. Up until that point, Guts had thought that he and Griffith were friends. He had reason to believe it as well. Griffith trusted him the most, besides Casca. He treated him like a best friend, and he called upon him to do his dirtiest deeds. It was after performing one such deed, the assassination of Count Julius and his son Adonis, that Guts needed a bit of reassurance about what he was doing in life. Taking Adonis had left him dazed, and he wanted answers that could give him clarity. He didn't expect it to come in the form of the negation of his perceived relationship with Griffith. Guts came across Griffith describing to Princess Charlotte what a friend is to him, and it doesn't include his soldiers. To Griffith, a friend is someone who has a dream of their own, who can stand beside him as an equal, an essential key that makes the world turn. His description of a friend made Guts realize all he was an errand boy. Sure, their relationship had made him grow a lot as a person. We learn that Guts has memorized the ambitions of all his men beyond the battlefield and that he's a hidden ace gambler. He's come a long way from his isolationist days, and it's thanks to Griffith giving him a place with the Falcons. But at the same time, hearing those words made it clear to Guts just how far beneath he was Griffith in the latter's definition of friendship. So he decided that he was going to find a way to change the words to their script. Guts wanted to find his own dream and cling to it as hard as Griffith did, because he wanted to stand beside him. While Griffith's path took him through the political route, for Guts it was bound to be the blade. So he decided to test his mettle as a warrior that has fought and survived an inescapable death already. During one of the offensive skirmishes of the 100-Year War, Guts comes across the leader of the Blue Whale Ultramarine Heavy Titanium Armored Tank Knights, the man we mentioned a few moments ago, Adon Kobervaltz. He doesn't bear any particular grudge against the man at first. He was just trying to help out a struggling Casca and beat out his rage at his self-realization while he was at it. But over time, Adon makes it personal by hunting him down, involving Casca in the mix. We'll get to her in a few as well. But Adon's master plan backfired because he became someone that not only contributed to Guts' growth as a fighter, but his overall growth as a person. While Guts and Casca were escaping their Tudor pursuers, Adon's forces managed to corner them. It was a sizable search party with 100 members in it. The Falcons were outnumbered 50-1. Guts decided to give himself a greater challenge by making it 100-1 and telling Casca to escape. He went on to spend the entire night cutting down one Tudor knight after the other, sometimes many simultaneously. But by the time morning came, everyone came to see him in a different light. Guts was a killer before, no doubt, but packing up 100 armored and trained knights in a single night is a feat that isn't heard of very often, and this instance made him the legendary 100-Man Slayer, which inspired his future companion Isidro to become a merc in the first place. And having accomplished such a feat, Guts became aware of the fact that he could no longer work with the band of the Falcon. If he had to truly discover the extent of his own strength, he'd have to do it alone. And this meant he would have to leave them. So that's exactly what he decides to do, but not before seeing through the campaign he was currently committed to. During this campaign, Guts notches another famous win under his belt by defeating the famed Tudor general Boscawen in single battle. The fight between Guts and Boscawen is a turning point in the story, not just because it helps Griffith secure the victory he needs to become the first common-born general, but also because this basically makes it clear to Guts that he needs to prepare for whatever the future holds in store for him. This is because during his battle with Boscawen, Guts' sword breaks and he's forced to replace it with another sword that pops up out of nowhere, which Griffith tells him to pick up and kill Boscawen with. While Guts gets the job done, he does wonder where the sword came from and why it felt so damn familiar. It was a curved sword, rather reminiscent to the one that Zod wielded in their fight. He'd been used as a tool of fate without his knowledge, but he was becoming aware of the fishiness of it all. With the defeat of Boscawen, Guts became one of the heroes of the critical Battle of Doldrey. The band of the Falcon managed to capture an impregnable fortress, thanks to his efforts, which were more than just this one epic fight in the 1997 anime, because there, Guts was also a part of the decoy squad that got the Tudor forces to open Doldry's gates. This achievement, plus their stellar record, was rewarded with them getting the noble title of the White Phoenix Knights. Griffith finally became a general, and Guts officially became a knight, thanks to the band of the Falcon's promotion, but he knew this was the end of the road for him. He'd tested the full extent of his strength against the best opposition he knew the world had to offer, and to find his purpose, he'd have to go somewhere else. That would mean telling Griffith he was leaving, which is where things take a major left turn. In the lead-up to his departure, many characters try to get him to stay, Rickert, Casca, obviously, and even Judo. They want him to remain because they're his friends, and while Guts acknowledges that, he prioritizes his own purpose over it. But when Griffith gets wind of what Guts wants, things get dark rather quickly. You see, Guts assumed he was Griffith's friend before confirming it with the man because that's what he thought the equal treatment he was receiving meant. When he realized they were on two different wavelengths, he accepted it and wanted to do whatever he could to sync those up, but he failed to consider just how serious Griffith was when he called Guts his property. After he defeated Guts, Griffith didn't say Guts worked for him. He said he owned Guts now. He would decide the day Guts would die, and from that day onward, Guts would fight for his cause. Now he was trying to break free from the talons of a Falcon, and the Falcon had no idea how to process it. He knew one thing though, he needed Guts around no matter the cost, and if that meant Griffith would have to kill him, then so be it. Guts had anticipated hostility from Griffith because of what he was proposing and what it would do to his plans, but he wholeheartedly believed that the White Falcon would bounce back from it. Guts had seen Griffith perform miracles from a military perspective. He had no shortage of Falcons that were just as good as him in other aspects, if not better. He thought Griffith would be fine once he left, because he thought that's the kind of person Griffith was. He didn't take into account his own idolization of him. Sure, Griffith beat him the first 2 times, but Guts had grown so much as a fighter since they last went at it that he knew that he was a new man. He killed 100 dudes in a single night, did we mention? Where was Griffith during that time? Oh, that's right, striking a delicate political balance. This is not a knock on the White Falcon by any means. He was just doing what he thought was necessary to make his dream come true. But it also made him delusional enough to think he could kill Guts, when in reality he couldn't even lay a finger on him, let alone put a hole in his chest. Griffith was, to put it simply, out of touch with combat. That, coupled with all of Guts' experience and gains, made what happened that snowy winter morning not that big of a shocker to us, but it broke Griffith's world, and Guts didn't see that coming, which is basically what ruined his life going forward. He did the same thing he did with Gambino, put up with dubious loyalty for way too long, and then thought of it as not being exploitative to cope with his own decisions. The future Black Swordsman snapped Griffith's sword in half and just walked off, leaving him with a simple farewell while internally entreating him to get past this rock in the road. It's just sad that he didn't know about thought transference at this stage in the tale, because it could have likely kept Griffith from going over the rocker and getting it on with Charlotte. Griffith went from being at the top of the world to the bottom cell of the Tower of Rebirth within less than 12 hours of Guts' departure, and would go on to pin the blame for all of his suffering during his year-long torture on him as well. Meanwhile, Guts, who had just begun his journey of self-discovery, was visited by a man that would end up shaping his life in a way, Skull Knight. The convergence of 2 strugglers, Guts and Skull Knight. The 100 Manslayer felt the absence of his irreplaceable friends the first night he spent alone, following his departure. It had been 3 years since Guts had camped by himself. He'd forgotten just how solemn and sinister a forest could feel at night time. He was jumpy as a flea, drawing his sword at the hint of another animal moving around in his vicinity, just generally contemplating whether he'd made the right decision or not. Guts was glad he had his sword beside him, because just like in his youth, it gave him comfort in moments of unease. But then again, he never even tried to change his own circumstances back then. He only accepted them and moved on. He was realizing that he might be throwing away things that could not easily be replaced, but then he brought himself back to the task at hand by telling himself that wasn't he fine as long as he kept warm. You can really feel Guts' confusion as he tries to decide whether his actions were motivated by his own desires or a sense of trying to become like Griffith. Corcus pops up in his head when he has this thought, as he reminds Guts that he can never be like Griffith. The pair have had their many differences in the past, but Guts has always been glad about the fact that Corcus hates on him openly. It allows him to reflect as well. But now, even that mirror was gone. The lone swordsman wasn't sure whether he was on the path of discovering his purpose in life, which felt like a lofty, unearned ideal to him, or if he was just running away from good things under the feeble pretext of self-searching and acquiring a dream. His thoughts were cut short thanks to a presence which shot his guard all the way up. At first, Guts thought it was Zod, the bloodlust he just felt, the sort of savagery that clings to your skin. This presence was very similar to the Immortal one's. Guts was frozen for a moment, where he felt as though someone was trying to attack him from behind. He swung for the head, but no one was there. He'd never misread the presence of an enemy. This vanishing target made Guts even more uneasy, and then he saw the source of it, and he could never look at life the same way ever after. There, emerging from the ether, stood a knight in skeletal armor, sitting atop a steed, decked out in its best Gothic attire. The Knight of Skeleton took one look at Guts and claimed that the gears had indeed started turning. He called on him as a struggler and gave him a more explicit warning about what was about to happen in a year down the line. Skull Knight informs him of a torrent of madness and death that was about to descend upon him and his comrades on a day when all of them, including his unkingly counterpart, would be gathered in that place. So far, his prophecy is pretty similar to Zod's, in that even the Immortal One warned him that an unending death would visit him and his friends when Griffith's ambition collapsed. But this is where things take a different direction, and set Skull Knight apart from Zod. Where Zod's warning ended ominously, where he made Guts and the Falcon's death seem inevitable, Skull Knight was more, well, shall we say, optimistic. Instead of spawning wings and flying off into the night sky, Skull Knight told Guts that he was a person that could resist that mad torrent of death, because of who he was and how he came into this world. Skull Knight reveals that he knows about Guts' birth circumstances, blatantly bringing up the fact that he was born from a corpse and cradled in blood and mud, but he claims that this makes him closer to death than anyone else, and cites it as a major reason why Guts is able to cheat death as well as he does. If you think about it, it does make sense, because Guts is not just one tough son of a gun, he's a lucky bastard as well. That time where Bazuso was unable to decapitate him because Guts broke his sword, the time Zod gave him an unseen assist and helped him win a fight he would have definitely lost otherwise. Guts has escaped the jaws of death on many an occasion, and Skull Knight claims it's because he's practically a tooth in that jaw that he excels at doing so. He tells him that the only way to even hope to survive what was about to happen in a year was for him to struggle, contend, wriggle, and despite what he feels like doing, never stop fighting. That alone is the sort of one who struggles against death. Guts isn't exactly paying attention to Skull Knight's warnings at this point. He's more concerned with how the hell does this random Skeletor cosplayer know about his life. Maybe that's why he misses what Skull Knight mutters to himself before departing the scene. His parting words talk of the abyss of despair, and how only a man holding up a broken sword would be able to stand firmly within such madness. That last bit isn't actually mentioned in the manga, because he trails off before disappearing into the astral world, but you can put two and two together by looking at everything else he said before leaving. This encounter is one of the most significant encounters in Guts' life, because he just met the only other man who had experienced exactly what he was about to experience himself a year later. Guts and Skull Knight walk the same path, even though they come from different eras. If you've seen any of our Skull Knight videos, you'll know what we're talking about. And if you haven't, what are you doing? Go watch them and then come back because, well, this is a long video, and you can definitely take your time finishing it. Context is king, after all. They're the only two humans in this world who have an inkling of what it feels like to be at the mercy of a tide stronger than them, and still resisting it because they choose to uphold their own ideals. But the difference is the motivation they have to do those things. Skull Knight resists the flow of causality consciously. He's very aware of its near-concrete machinations, and can even perceive its flow and interpret what it has in store for the world, considering he often hands out prophetic warnings that come true. His warning about the Eclipse, the incarnation ceremony, what had happened when Guts tried to help Casca, all of it came true, just like he said. Skull Knight accepts the fact that he resides within the causal current, and chooses to resist its flow with that awareness he's cultivated. Guts simply rejects its existence and takes stride after stride, confident that they belong to his feet and no one else's. It's not like he isn't aware that fate is a thing, that causality is real, because he sees the signs of the eclipses coming early on and does wonder what it all means. It's his nature to move forward without taking into consideration the threat of such things, because he fights to survive death and is willing to do the most despicable things to his enemies to win, just how his father taught him. Guts is like a battering ram, smashing at the causal gate because he wants to get past it. It's as simple as that. In later years, Skull Knight would come to recognize this tendency of his as a good thing, because it meant that Guts wasn't just a leaf that floated along with the stream of causality. Rather, he was a leaping fish that broke the current and changed its flow. Even if it was a minor change, Skull Knight was content with the ripple effects it would cause in the grand scheme of things, and he chose to instead bet on those, as he did every time he unsheathed his own sword. The two strugglers would come to have a mutual respect and understanding for each other's stories, but one thing didn't change. Guts never fully grasped the weight of Skull Knight's words in the moment that they were put across. While he would be grateful to the foe of the Inhumans on many occasions for his assists, he saw him as a bringer of bad news. Every time Skull Knight came around, he helped him out, but always seemed to leave him with a bigger question to answer at a later point in time. He mostly dismissed his prophetic words initially because he was able to overcome everything with his own strength back then. It was only after his words shifted towards those that Guts held dear that the mercenary started to fully understand the scope and depth of the actions unfolding in his life, both by his hand and causalities. But now that we've brought up the topic of love, let's talk about the person that helped Guts get over his oldest traumas with their affection, Casca. The sparks of his life, his love story with Casca, and the day Guts found his true purpose. When he joined the band of the Falcon, Guts thought Casca was a pain in the ass, and the feeling was mutual. He acknowledged her strength and skill as a warrior. He was shocked he was facing a woman when they first clashed swords. But Casca was jealous of the attention Griffith gave to Guts after recruiting him, and it was plain for all to see. Corcus would often tease her that Guts has replaced her as Griffith's favourite, and Casca never quite managed to say that out loud herself. So instead, she would project her anger on Guts by berating him, telling him to get himself killed quickly, calling him a rabid dog. You name it, baby. Her naggings weren't always without merit. In the first numbered chapter of Berserk, while Guts does manage to distract the enemy long enough for his boys to get the job done, he goes off plan to do it. And he does that kind of thing really often. Despite being Griffith's trusted right hand of doom, Guts still wasn't the official second in command of the Falcons. It was Casca. She was in the right to reprimand him for disobeying orders, because that was her job, and Guts accepted that. It still didn't make her any less annoying to him, so their relationship remained on the rock until the Falcons' first fight against Adon Cobravolts. We've already mentioned this briefly earlier in the video, but we'll get into a bit more detail over here. The reason that fight's important isn't just because it contributed to Guts' growth as a fighter, it also opened the doors to a relationship between him and Casca. Remember how we told you guys that Guts took up Cobravolts' challenge in the first place because he wanted to save Casca? Well, the reason she got into the situation was because she was experiencing menstrual fever, and she didn't tell anyone about it because she didn't want to let Griffith down. It made her a liability in battle though, and that became clear when she couldn't handle Adon. Guts stepped in to help her, but they both ended up falling into a stream below the cliff they were on, and Casca passed out. The swordsman pulled her out of the water, took her into the hollow of a tree, and protected her the entire time she was unconscious. Casca's fever made her body cold, so Guts helped warm her up, the same way she did for him the first time he fought with Griffith. See, a big reason for Casca's resentment of Guts is the fact that Griffith made her heat up his body after their first fight, because otherwise he would have likely died. But to Guts, that was the first time he didn't shy away from human contact. He was having a nightmare about all his traumas and guilt, and as he convulsed in his sleep, he realized someone was touching him. His immediate reaction was to ask them to get away, as is to be expected, but when realized it was Casca, he softened. When he woke up, he thanked her immediately, but was met with a chilly wall because the rest of the boys were teasing her about what had happened. But that didn't matter to Guts. She'd saved his life, and he had never forgotten that. And moreover, he was very impressed with the fact that Casca had chosen a warrior's life considering the things women's bodies went through regularly. When he removed her wet clothes, Guts noticed her menstrual blood and realized the true source of her fever. He thought to himself it must be tough being a woman, and he wrapped Casca in leaves and kept watch over her the entire night with a renewed appreciation for her. This was him repaying her kindness, so naturally, once Casca woke him, she thwacked him with a thunderous punch. She lamented the fact that out of all the people in the band, it was Guts who saved her, and she kept trying to hit him, so he called her out for going to battle with menstrual fever. He did it harshly, going at her womanhood, and he realized his mistake, so he apologized, but it stirred something in Casca. She'd been severely mocked and undermined by Adon on the account of her sex, endured some rather terrible and salacious slander, but in the end, she felt as though her womanhood betrayed her by giving her the fever at such an important point in her life. After she calms down, Guts asks Casca for the reason she joined the Falcons, and she responds by telling him her origin story. Over the course of her retelling of everything that had happened to her before she became a Falcon, and since then, Casca and Guts came to understand each other much better. She was finally able to admit her jealousy to his face, and yes, he did find it annoying that she was beating at his chest and crying while asking why Griffith got impulsive when it came to him, but he understood her feelings. Guts was a little surprised that a high and mighty type like Griffith would sell his body to Genon in exchange for money, but just chalked that up to one of the many signs he ignored about the Falcon's true nature. The important thing here is what it did for Guts and Casca. While she was spilling her heart out, Guts was preparing medicine for her. Suddenly, they heard footsteps outside the tree hollow they were hiding in, and Guts knew by instinct that they had to leave, even though Casca was in no shape. He gave her the medicine and they set off once it got dark enough, but Casca was struggling to even walk properly. So, Guts teased her by hitting her right where it hurt and using her womanhood as a point to motivate her to keep walking. Thanks to his instigation, Casca was able to keep up with the pursuers initially, but she soon realized that she was just getting in his way. She begrudgingly made her escape and by the time she returned with backup, both of their feelings towards each other had changed. Where Casca wanted Guts dead before, now she was getting her entire band to come and rescue him, even though he didn't need it. He might have denied that he didn't do it to save her life, but even Guts thought of that when he was fighting Adon's 100 men. When he woke up after creating his legend, he and Casca had a conversation that made both of them realize they were developing feelings for each other, but neither stated them aloud. And then Guts left the band, and Casca was left struggling with the question of why she felt sad that he was leaving when she wanted that very thing for years on end. Before his departure, Judo asked Guts why he didn't try to stick around for Casca or take her with him instead, but he wasn't blind and knew she loved Griffith from the way she spoke of him. And also, Casca had told him that her life's purpose was to be Griffith's sword. Who was he to take a sword away from its sheath? Thus, he left, and their dynamic wouldn't resume until they'd reunite with the Falcons a year later after his departure, and it's during the year-long period where Guts realizes his true purpose in life. Once he leaves the Falcons, Guts goes into the mountains for some good old-fashioned nature training. He finds a nice waterfall spot that would allow him to train vigorously, with regimes involving things like tackling falling logs and such, but also isolate himself long enough to understand what it is that he wanted from his life. During this time, he lives with a blacksmith named Godot and his adopted daughter Erika, who have a hut near the falls and can conveniently fix his sword whenever they break, which happens a lot, considering Guts trains hard, to say the least. Godot thinks Guts is a selfish customer because he's stubborn-headed and somehow manages to break blades faster than Godot can remake them, not to mention the many injuries his daughter has to tend to while Guts is their guest. But in more ways than one, this master blacksmith, who's also the creator of Guts' iconic Dragon Slayer, acts as a mentor to him on decisions that matter most to him in life. The old man is a lot like Guts. He spent his entire life dedicated to the craft of smithing weapons because it was all he'd ever known. He came from a line of blacksmiths and could hold a hammer before he could walk, but Godot knew he wasn't living a life worth living. He was just going through the motions. It was only after meeting Erika that things changed for him, and so when he sees Guts, he sees himself. Maybe that's why Godot always has words of wisdom for him, and one such moment was when he made Guts realize his innate love for the battle. One time, after his ridiculous training, Guts asked Godot why he became a blacksmith. The answer Godot ultimately ended up giving him was that the sparks he saw within the fleeing moments where his hammer made contact with hot steel was what gave life to him. This made something in Guts' head click, and he realized that he lived by the sword most of his life, to the point his blade felt like a part of his own body to him. The only time when his mind stops thinking and just does things is when he's swinging his sword. But compared to his hand, his sword had played a larger role in shaping his life, and he came to realize that he too found meaning in sparks. Not from the ones generated at an anvil, but the kind that's born from the clashing of steel. Guts came to the conclusion that he found life within the sparks produced by his sword whenever it clanged against another's, because he realized that he did have an innate desire to test himself against stronger and stronger opponents. He wanted to grow as a fighter for himself and fight battles on his own terms for his own sake, unlike his previous life of survival and servitude. With this new understanding, after spending a year freeloading at Godot's hut, Guts sets out on a journey to test his own worth and enrolls in a tournament. Surprisingly enough, the only one we see take place in a series with a decidedly medieval background. Guts is amused by the warrior that was making every other Western fighter look like a chump, a Kushan man called Sylar. He enters the tournament against him and makes quick work of the guy, even though his weapons and fighting style were completely different from anything Guts had ever experienced. His performance is so effortless that he calls Sylar a circus clown, and by the time he's done with him, everyone believes it. Unbeknownst to him, he just insulted the prince of the Bakaraka clan, a group of Kushan ethnicity that specialized in assassination. But it didn't matter, even when they met a second time under conditions that favored Sylar. After the tournament loss, Sylar gathered a group of mercenaries to take out a group of outlaws and ended up fighting Guts again. This time, he used projectiles like the chakram discs and a 10-bladed sword called the Urumi to try and disorient his opponent even further, but Guts practically sunned him. This second consecutive defeat forced the pinnacle of the deadliest assassins in the world to go back to the drawing board and recommit to his training regime, because Sylar was frankly scared of Guts' fighting ability and the gulf between them. It just goes to show you what a man that knows what he wants is capable of accomplishing, and as luck would have it, this fight also ended up reuniting him with Casca. He must have felt weird hearing us say that Guts fought on the side of some outlaws a few moments ago, considering everything else we've said in this video. But here's the kicker. Those outlaws are actually his former comrades. After punking Sylar, Guts was offered a place in the tournament sponsor's retinue, but he rejected because he wasn't interested. What he was interested in knowing was the location of the outlaw band that the people around him were planning to hunt down, because it was the band of the Falcon, and they specifically brought up Casca as being their leader. Of course, Guts was unaware of the fact that Griffith had been put in jail for rocking Charlotte's world, and he was once again baffled by this lapse in his idol's judgment. His reunion with the band of the Falcon was an awkward one, because he strode onto the scene like a hero late to the party, but once everyone settled down, he was on board with their plans to rescue Griffith. Clearly, Guts still held Griffith in the same regard as ever, because he too was hopeful that the Falcon would soar again one day, but he should have known better. We'll get to why in just a bit, but it wasn't as if he was just going to be given his old spot back in the band just because he saved them, no matter how happy his old unit was to see him. Corcus wasn't going to have it, for reasons that should be obvious by now, and surprisingly, neither was Casca. After they dealt with the raid from Silat's party, Casca took Guts to a secluded region of the base camp and asked him to draw his sword. Before he could react, she attacked him, and it was with killing intent because Guts had to nearly draw his sword fully to defend. He was confused as to why she was doing this, but it became clear soon enough. She still blamed him for everything that Griffith did. Casca filled him in on what happened and blamed Guts for it all, claiming he became Griffith's weakness. So him leaving broke the man. But Guts wasn't having it. He let her stab him in the torso and held her sword there, asking her what else he should have done. Even he was having a hard time believing Griffith could do such a thing, which Casca saw plainly. So she finally came out with the real truth. She was at her breaking point. She admitted that she loved Griffith and that she knew there was no real chance for her to be with him because of his ambitions. But she regretted never trying anyway, and now there was no way for her to try. She felt as though clinging to the band was clinging to her feelings in a way, and besides, she was really tired. Casca tried to commit suicide by falling off the cliff, and her last words would have been, "You do it," to Guts, had he not saved her. When he did, she realized that more than her feelings for Griffith, her feelings for Guts were what was bothering her. She realized they existed the day he left, and she didn't pay Griffith as much attention as she did to him, but she resisted it because accepting it would have meant that she would be negating her past, or at least that's what she thought at the time. But now, things were different. Guts and Casca realized they loved each other and truly expressed it by consummating that love in the forest, and it even resulted in a major mental breakthrough for Guts. As they were, doing it, Guts began getting rough with Casca before he started getting PTSD flashbacks to the time Donovan violated him. He nearly choked Casca in his delirium. Once he realized what he was doing, he broke down completely. For the first time in his life, he admitted that he killed his own father to someone that wasn't himself. And he also explained the reason behind him not wanting to get touched by anyone. He expected Casca to reject him because he did nearly kill her after all, but she instead chose to embrace him, wounds and all. This acceptance made Guts let go of his guilt over killing Gambino and get over his childhood trauma to a great extent. The brief period of time they spent as a couple was the happiest Guts and Casca had been in years. Even though they were on a rescue mission deep within territory soon after they made things official, their chemistry made it feel like we were watching a rom-com and not a serious story about death, betrayal, violence, and tragedy. As fans of the series, we were over the moon for our boy because Guts deserved all this and much more. It's a crying shame then that it was taken away from him as soon as he got it, and in the worst way imaginable. The arrival of the fated hour, Guts and the Eclipse. Even before entering the Tower of Rebirth to rescue Griffith, Guts should have known that things wouldn't be as simple as putting him back on top and rebuilding the band from scratch. The reputation damage to the Falcons was already pretty heavy and would become irreparable if the King of Midland continued to have his way. But more than that, Griffith had spent an entire year in imprisonment. They didn't know what kind of conditions he was kept under. Guts had been a mercenary his entire life. He should have been able to anticipate that they'd find Griffith mangled and unable to speak, let alone walk. He himself would go on to be subjected to torture multiple times over in his life later on, but in his mind, the White Falcon was still the shining beacon of hope and accomplishments that he wasn't to himself. Guts was still on his path to discovering his purpose. He'd crossed important milestones, yes, but he was nowhere near to being as sure of where he wanted to go as Griffith was. Even after a year apart, he looked up to the White Falcon and wanted to save him because, after all, they were friends, no matter how Griffith defined their relationship. So it was understandable seeing Guts break down at the sight of Griffith's tortured body and hug him the first chance he got. But had he been even a little bit less emotional in that situation, he'd have understood that Griffith wanted nothing to do with him. In fact, the only reason he wanted to see Guts again was so he could strangle him to death with his own hands, because quite like Casca, Griffith blamed Guts for his problems as well. But unlike her, he never really showed the kind of awareness or acceptance of his own words and actions within their dynamic, and his horrifying torture had also left his mind broken. Griffith wanted Guts dead, alive, and everything in between. And when he realized who had come to save him, the fallen Falcon tried to raise his mangled hands to choke out Guts. His arm tendons had been cut off, so he would never have succeeded. But this small gesture went unnoticed by everyone in the room. If they picked up on it, maybe things could have gone a bit differently. After Guts took one look at Griffith's face, his mind went black with rage. He broke the locked cell door with his sword, whilst impaling the jailer who was responsible for Griffith's state at the same time. He ruthlessly murdered the dummy and cleared out the rest of the Tower of Rebirth pretty much by himself. Guts became a one-man army in the Griffith rescue mission, and while the Falcon was grateful for his presence, he also couldn't stand how far he'd come. Griffith hated his own inability to do things, now that he couldn't walk, talk, or even hold things. And here was Guts, taking on troops the size of small armies by himself, stealing Casca from him, and even managing to kill what they couldn't kill together all those years ago. Griffith had a front row seat to Guts' battle with the ape Apostle Wild, and as the fight progressed, you could see Griffith's expression go from one of concern to one of observation, and then pure jealousy. If you want more details on that fight, check out our Wild Anatomy video. It's a testament to Miura's drawing skill that he was able to convey that much emotion by just showing us Griffith's eyes. We just wish Guts would have seen them as well, because he would have tried to have a brotherly moment with him, putting his armor on him, handing him a sword and telling him that everything was going to be okay, when he knew damn well it wasn't. And he certainly wouldn't have done anything close to that after Griffith tried to assault Casca on some weird power trip type shit. To him, this man was still the great leader that inspired him to find his own life's purpose. So, he was shocked that after going through so much together, Griffith would run away from him again. Well, the shock was more due to the fact that Griffith was an invalid now and he managed to hijack a horse wagon somehow, but you get what we mean. A few seconds ago, he was trying to convince his girlfriend to leave with him now that the job here was done, while she wanted to do the opposite for all the wrong reasons. Now, he was hunting down his deranged leader, wondering how in the hell he was managing to ride a wagon in the first place and hoping nothing terrible happened to him. He should have been running away instead, because as soon as Guts reached him, Griffith activated his Behelit and caused the advent of Berserk's most pivotal event, the Eclipse. Guts was one of the first people to keep a calm mind in that domain of madness. Faces in the skies and on the earth, apostles surrounding him and his comrades from all sides, 4 towering godlike demonic beings beckoning his friend to become a part of their ranks. Guts defiantly told them that Griffith would never accept their deal, because he'd seen this guy naked, and he doesn't even have a tail. But, like we told you guys a moment ago, he didn't know the extent to which Griffith blamed him for his own problems. Griffith was mute, but he was listening to everything Guts was saying, and while somewhere in a small corner of his heart he was glad to have a friend like him, his grief over losing his dream was far greater. The God Hand knew that if Guts stayed beside Griffith, they'd lose their chance to convert him. So they separated them by raising Griffith up on an altar. Guts started scaling the altar, trying to rescue his friend from them, because despite being a thick-headed person in general, Guts was pretty good at keeping an objective view on things unfolding in front of him. And he's the only person in the series that's blatantly called out the God Hand's manipulation of their targets. He believed that Griffith didn't truly want to sacrifice his friends in exchange for power, that he'd reject the offer and stand with them, even with the body he had now. When he saw Griffith say the words to the sacrificial segment of the Eclipse ritual, he couldn't believe it. And as he saw his former leader transform into a demon within a glowing cocoon with his own eyes, the realization sank into Guts' guts. He asked the unhearing Griffith if this was truly what he wanted, and with rage boiling within every cell of his body, he turned his attention to the apostles. Before the Eclipse, Guts had fought 2 apostles and barely managed to defeat one of them. But now, overcome with rage at Griffith, the God Hand, and the ugly word that put him and his beloved in a situation like this, Guts blacked out. He started killing apostles left, right, center, rampaging through them while hoping that his friends survive as well. His heart starts breaking when he comes across Gaston, who's on the verge of death but manages to have one last conversation with his captain. He uses Guts' tag team partner Pippin's corpse to lure him into an ambush, but the swordsman is more battle-tested than any of these dummies could have even expected him to be. What really brings Guts' one-man offensive against the God Hand's thralls is the fact that they get their hands on Casca. While Guts and Griffith were busy interacting with the God Hand in their own respective ways, the rest of the Falcons were put in a defensive position by their leader, Casca, and treated her men to not lose discipline in the face of this insanity. But when the apostles attacked, her words turned to wind irrespective of the respect they had for her. Every lost Falcon was chased, attacked, devoured, and sent to hell by the apostles. Heck, even Corcus had a depressing death, and this is a guy Miura built up to be particularly unlikable. Casca was managing to fend off apostle attacks somehow, but she knew it was only a matter of time before she was eaten herself. She questions why they ended up in such an infernal place, and just then, Judo swoops in to save her from an apostle. He gets her a fair distance away from the main action, but in the end, they catch catch up with her and strip her down so they can have some fun before eating her as well. Guts sees this and tries to cut a path toward Casca when the entire domain rumbles with a heartbeat. The cocoon atop the God Hand altar breaks, and from within the amniotic fluid that was his sacrificed comrade's blood rises Griffith, transformed into the fifth and final Demon King. Guts is shocked by this sight. As he was trying to get to Casca, an apostle had bit into his left arm to stop him from getting there, but now every last one of those damn creeps was bowing their heads in reverence to his former leader. The entire interstice fell deathly silent, and what broke it was Griffith's summoning of, you guessed it, Casca. As a God Hand, Griffith now has instinct control over the psyches of every apostles in existence. He makes them stop trying to have fun with her because he wanted it all for himself. Guts' expression went from disbelief to one that begs for mercy to one of unbridled rage and malice. His eyes blanked as he tried to yank his arm out of the apostle's mouth. When that didn't work, Guts attacked its mouth with his sword, but his sword broke. So he took the broken sword to his own arm and performed the most brutal self-amputation you'll ever see. He was going crazy because there, right in front of him, his idol, his former leader, the man who inspired him to become everything he is and will be, was violating the love of his life and making the demons who killed their comrades assist him with it. Guts' mind was consumed with a single thought in that moment, saving Casca by killing Griffith. But even after breaking free, he couldn't do that. He was held down by numerous other apostles who kept him there and turned his head back towards the gruesome scene because their master wanted him to see it. Casca was gone by this point. If Guts was having his world broken, imagine what she was going through. Griffith was her literal god, and now this was being done to her by him. All she managed to get out of her mouth was to plead Guts to look away because she knew what this act meant in his mind, and even as she was getting raped, she didn't want him to suffer. When Griffith was done with his abhorrent act, he tossed her aside as if she were nothing more than a used sex toy. The point was made very clearly by him. The game had changed. He was the one with the power now, and Guts, the helpless invalid. As he was struggling to make it to Casca a second time, one of the apostles holding Guts down blinded him in his right eye, and the man himself collapsed after making one last-ditch effort to end his tormentors. He was unconscious for this part, but just as that happened, a Skull Knight broke into the interstice, chopped up some apostles, got a cheap shot in on Void, and rescued him and Casca from that place. Outside, Rickard gave both of them some emergency first aid, and then Skull Knight took them all back to Gullo's hut because, as it turns out, the old blacksmith's story about his ore mine being an elfin sanctum was true, and elfin magic was going to be crucial if Guts and Casca wanted to live a normal life from this point onward. Well, as normal as their lives could be, considering the shape they were both in. Before he came to his senses, Guts was having a nightmare. Not the usual one about Gambino or Donovan. No, he'd worked that out with himself. This time, he was dreaming about the Eclipse, or rather, the lead-up to it. It was as if his comrades had been entranced into going to the site of that fated day as they marched in a single file with blank expressions, and Guts was trying his best to dissuade them, but to no avail. Of course, we know it's because he didn't want them marching to their own dooms because they blindly trusted Griffith, but the damage had already been done, in more ways than one. When Guts woke up 4 days after the eclipse, he was missing his left arm and right eye, and was covered in bandages from head to toe, thanks to the eclipse's injuries. His mind was barely processing the events that had occurred, and he was confused as to why Rickard and Erica were together, when they were two completely unrelated aspects of his life. But as soon as Rickard brought up what had happened to the others, Guts panicked and rushed towards Casca. He, branded swordsman, had endured a lot in that whirlwind. He'd faced death, betrayal, and a lot worse. He was glad to see Casca had survived with him, but his heart broke when he realized that her mind was no longer hers. Because of the immense mental and emotional trauma of what she was exposed to during the eclipse, Casca's mind had reverted to a childlike state. She couldn't even form sentences, only blurt out noises, and the only one she trusted was Erica, who was more her age now from a mental perspective. Guts didn't know what to do with all this information. He was anxious, afraid, wanted to die, but also didn't want to die. He decided he was going to go for a sprint and run his demons out, even as Rickard warned him not to do so. During the sprint, Guts recalled the faces of every comrade he lost to the eclipse, even Corcus. He was running like a man desperate to keep a hold of his memories, thinking of all his good times and bad times with the Falcons, as his bandages shed off of his body and his injured eye cried tears of blood. At last, Guts arrived in an open field, where his mind turned toward the greatest source of his happiness and sadness, Griffith. Or should we call him Femto, since that's now his true existential form. Guts was grateful to Griffith for bringing irreplaceable things into his life, but he hated the man with the purity of Heisenberg's meth for what he did to those irreplaceable things. It looked like he was about to make some sort of decision when he was surrounded by evil voices that sounded similar to apostles, but were clearly different. These guys looked more like spirits, and as Guts backed up to prepare for some sort of attack, Skull Knight showed up behind him. He told Guts that he should take heed, because from this point onward, this was going to be his life. Every single night, whenever he roamed into a place where darkness triumphed over light, Guts would be attacked by evil spirits and worse things, because he was now a resident of the interstice. As a branded individual that didn't end up in the abyss, everything that was evil in the world would now try to get him there. So the only way for Guts to survive it was to keep fighting till his mind went numb, and then some. You guys can imagine the choice he makes, and it inadvertently leads to the birth of an apostle's worst nightmare, the Black Swordsman. A one-man declaration of war against all of demonkind, the birth of the Black Swordsman and Beast of Darkness. After Guts is filled in on his situation, Skull Knight tosses him a sword to help him defend himself against the dead spirits, and the off chance that they end up possessing him. Guts proves why he managed to survive the Eclipse by dishing out punishment on those dead bastards even after losing an arm and depth perception. Skull Knight admits that he sees why Guts is a struggler like him, destined by fate to contend against the Inhumans, but this is where Guts draws the line. As he chops up one dead spirit after the other, he declares that this isn't his destiny, it's simply warfare. One side wins as long as the other side ends up dead, so he declares war on all of them. The restless souls trying to take over his flesh, on the apostles that killed his friends and turned him into dinner, and especially the God Hand, with his primary target for revenge being their newest member, Griffith. Just as he commits himself to this new dark path of life, the spirits vanish because, well, as Skull Knight explains, they find another torch. Turns out Casca left the cave that wards off these souls, and the pair of strugglers make for her as quickly as they can, riding Skull Knight's flying steed. When they arrive, the foe with Inhumans senses something is wrong because while the spirits are flocking to Casca, they're not doing her any damage. Guts doesn't care about his cryptic explanations and understandings. He rushes to Casca to see if she was okay, but she clutches him hard as if she were writhing from pain. Guts is confused. He thinks the demons have done something to her, and as fate would have it, he was right, just not in the way he was thinking. Casca was in pain because of something a demon did to her, but it wasn't these spirits gathered around her. Her convulsions ended when her nether regions spit out blood, and out came a tiny, demonic fetus. Casca was giving birth. The baby was a demon because she got violated by Griffith. Guts instinctively tried to kill the baby, considering he just vowed to destroy all demons, but then Skull Knight clarified for him that this child wasn't a result of Casca's violation. She was pregnant before the eclipse began, and the child growing within her was corrupted by femto seed. Guts pales as soon as he realizes what this means for him, because the clear implication here is that the demon child is his son. With tears in his eyes, he tears the baby away from Casca because his desire for revenge is greater in that moment than his realization of fatherhood. She leaps at him because she wants to protect her baby. The son saves them both from doing something stupid because it sends all the spirits in their vicinity back into the astral world, including the demon child. Skull Knight warns Guts to prepare not just for the fight ahead, but also to confront his kid, because, demon or not, all children yearn for their parents. So would be the case for Guts' son as well. He disappears into the night wishing Guts a good journey ahead, unaware, or perhaps just not addressing the fact that he just helped create a monster. After putting Casca back in the mine cave, and nearly submitting to his lust before collecting himself, Guts makes up his mind to go after the apostles, all by his lonesome. He has Godot prepare all black armor for him, and when Erica asks him why that was the case, he replies by saying he'll be fighting in lots of dark places, because they were in the darkness. Skull Knight had told him that at nightfall, and in especially dark places in the world where light didn't reach the earth, Guts would be attacked by evil creatures. Moreover, his brand of sacrifice would act as a homing device, because using its pain, he could gauge how far he was from an apostle. He planned to do exactly that, disregarding Skull Knight's warning about what happens to a man that walks a path as dark as his. Rather, he chooses to embrace his inner malice as a force that feeds his every movement, and this is what causes the birth of the infamous Black Swordsman. Guts' first apostle hunt is a lucky one for him, because he doesn't even have to search for his mark. He shows up at Godot's doorstep. The Hound Apostle had followed the scent of Guts' brand from the Eclipse site, and came all the way up here to the mountains for his leftovers. The Black Swordsman's disgusting look of glee made it clear to us that he wasn't the prey here. He was going to be the predator. Guts had just gotten some pretty sweet upgrades to his arsenal. Rickett gave him a mechanical arm to replace his lost left arm. This arm was magnetized to help Guts hold and swing a sword. It was outfitted with a rapid-fire crossbow and a hidden arm cannon, which nearly dislocates Guts' shoulder the first time he uses it. He adds throwing knives to his weaponry, and would later also add miniaturized bombs to help him create openings, hold off pursuers, and cause explosions as and when he deemed necessary. He only used the arm cannon against the Hound, but that was all he needed, given that this wasn't exactly a combat-savvy apostle like Zod or Wild. Well, that, and the best big sword in manga history, Dragon Slayer. Godot wasn't sure what kind of a war Guts was off to fight this time around, but he could tell from his eyes that he was damn serious about it. So he forged him a sword he thought would be capable of beating his enemies, but he made it to deal with humans. Guts was about to fight monsters that no human could hope to even stand up in front of. These guys were akin to dragons, and he needed a dragon slayer appropriate for the job. The new sword Goddo gave him broke after landing half a dozen strikes on the Hound Apostle, and Guts' arm cannon attack was done more from a sense of taking a breather rather than inflicting lethal damage. He got knocked all the way into Goddo's armor hut by that blast, but it was a blessing in disguise for him, because, as it turns out, Goddo had been holding out on him. Guts took one look at Dragonslayer and knew he'd found the perfect tool for his job. He chastised the blacksmith from a sense of familiarity and used Dragonslayer to butcher the Hound Apostle to death, shocking even its creator with his wielding of it. Guts then marched off into the cold night, heading into a storm of death all by his lonesome as a one-man death machine. Rickett was concerned about the effect this might end up having on Guts' psyche over time, and he was right, because the Black Swordsman was a destructive force of nature. In the 2 years that he was active as an apostle killer, Guts garnered an infamous reputation as a man who left men, women, children, villages, and sometimes entire towns in ruins. The common man had no idea that an apostle was a human corrupted by evil. They didn't know that when apostles died, they reverted to their human bodies. They only knew that whenever some kind of evil monster would pop up to terrorize a region, the Black Swordsman would show up to fight it, decimating the entire territory in the process. Guts became insensitive to collateral damage in his time as an apostle hunter because in his mind, everyone who got in his way was an ant. Anyone who died because of his fight deserved it, because they weren't smart enough to get out of his way in time. And besides, do you think killing an apostle is an easy task? Just watch the first couple of fights Guts has in the manga. Taking down the Snake Baron was such a tall order that Guts ended up having to nearly level a town to finish the job, and a lot of that was because of the Baron's insane resilience. The Apostle was also responsible for a lot of the carnage caused, as the Snake Baron rode into the town as he was supposed to be governing and started killing and devouring its citizens as soon as he arrived. But because he died and reverted to his human form afterward, the blame couldn't be pinned on him. As the survivor, Guts would also be a person of interest, and because he killed scores of apostles in his time as the Black Swordsman, he ended up on the Holy Sea's radar. The Holy Iron Chain Knights were sent out by the Miracle Recognition Department of the Sea to confirm whether the Black Swordsman was the prophesied Falcon of Darkness, because all the signs were there. The Falcon's prophecy describes the Eclipse as being a trigger point for the Age of Darkness, and Guts' actions and their consequences certainly make him look evil, but the Sea lacks context. They're unaware of the full story, and that Griffith is the man they're looking for, not Guts. And the irony of it is that they end up giving the man destined to cause their doom the keys to the kingdom, but we'll get to that later down the line. In the 2 years he was hunting down apostles, he managed to avenge several of his comrades. The first apostle he kills in the first chapter of Berserk is the female apostle that devoured Corcus during the Eclipse. The Snake Baron was also present at the ritual, though he doesn't exactly consume an important Falcon. Guts packs him up anyway. He takes step after step toward his vengeance, and ends up avenging people close to him during the process. But the closest Guts ever got to Griffith was when he fought the Slug Count, the same apostle that used Pippin's body as a decoy during the Eclipse. Up until that point, he'd been killing apostles, but not getting a damn clue about where he could find the God Hand. He kept interrogating every apostle he killed, but none of them would give up their location. Neither could they give him a way to reach their masters, considering the God Hand existed deep within the astral world, and apostles only met them when summoned to special ceremonies. That changed in his fight with the Slug Count because, well, for starters, Slug Count still had a behelit. Usually, Guts doesn't exactly survey the aftermath of a battle because he needs to be on the move constantly. Lingering in one place for too long attracts too many dead spirits to him, and most apostles lurk within the shadows of deep forests and such anyway. If he had done that, he'd have realized that a few of them left their behelits behind following their deaths. But perhaps this is for the best, as Skull Knight ends up adding those to his Sword of Actuation collection after Guts leaves the scene. The Slug Count situation was different because his physician managed to steal his behelit, and the only reason it found its way back to him was because Guts brought it with himself for their final showdown. The Black Swordsman was known as an apostle killer by every apostle by this point, so at first, Slug Count relished the challenge. But when he was reduced to a decapitated head, he too became acquainted with the fear that the Black Swordsman inspired in every apostle. And wanting to escape the fate so many of his kin had suffered, he unwittingly activates the behelit, summoning the God Hand once again. Turns out, Slug Count wasn't destined for a second reincarnation, but he rejects the offer because it would involve him sacrificing his daughter. All he wanted was for the God Hand to kill Guts, but they rejected that proposal because 1. He couldn't be used as a sacrifice, and 2. They didn't see him as a threat, or the Count's requests as even worthy of consideration. All this wasn't bothering the Black Swordsman though, because he finally had what he wanted. Griffith. Guts immediately attacks Griffith upon seeing him again, but is incapacitated by the pain his God Hand hood evokes within Guts' brand of sacrifice. He persists, but is sent flying into a pillar by Griffith's spatial powers. Guts is nearly pulled into the abyss alongside the Slug Count by the Vortex of Souls, but he manages to get one last shot in on Griffith. He fires his hand cannon at the demon, but Griffith just tanks it with an invisible spatial wall. Because of the cannon's impact, the souls of the damned drop Guts, and he lives to fight another day. But his window is closed at this point, and moreover, he's created an enemy he never wanted in the first place. Throughout his entire time as the Black Swordsman, the only thing that gave Guts' sword a pause was when children got involved. Adults had the agency to read a situation and know what was unfolding, as well as the ignorance to still choose to freak out about things instead of doing something about them. But it was different in the case of children. Guts knew that kids were innocent. They didn't know any better most of the time and were easy targets for manipulation, or worse yet, sacrifice. Teresia was about to become a sacrificial lamb when he was trying to get his revenge, but he was glad that she did end up that way. Even after she blamed him for what were clearly her father's choices, Guts saved her falling to her death and accepted her vitriol as yet another addition to his own guilty conscience. Guts wasn't trying to prove something to her when he threw Teresia a knife after she expressed the desire to kill herself. He was just showing her that she could do whatever she wanted with her life, as long as it was her choice. That she chose to blame him instead was his cross to bear, and he was genuinely sad about it. His accidental killing of Colette, the girl from Chapter 2 who helped him out of the rain with her aged father, caused him to vomit because he couldn't believe what he'd just done, even though he knew the girl's body was possessed. It's clear that Guts has a problem involving children into his story, knowing the jaded places it takes him to on occasion. But even that's taken away from him when he comes across Rosine. Up until that point, children had only been collateral damage in his war, but now they became the target. One night, as he was resting underneath the tree, Guts heard a group of bandits set up camp nearby and harass a girl they kidnapped to sell off into slavery. The girl, called Jill, was about to be violated when Guts stood up from the darkness and saved her life. He did it mostly because he realized the tree they were all standing around was cursed and would kill all of them if he didn't kill it first. But yes, saving Jill from a terrible fate was a part of his motivation. After he saved her, he took her safely back home, expecting to extort the family for a reward of some sort. He ended up hitting the jackpot when he realized an apostle was active in their village, because this made his hunt easier. He wouldn't have to roam around to find one like he always did. But push came to shove when he realized that this apostle, who became one of those demons when she was a teenager herself, was kidnapping children from the village and turning them into her pseudos. When he realized that these guys were all kids, he went into hyperventilation mode because all of his ideals, morals, and experiences with kids collided into this one hunt. Guts had never had a good relationship with his own kid. The demon child would show up in front of his father on nights of the full moon, craving his affection but being spurned every time by his fury for his kind. He showed up again when Guts was tracking the Elf Apostle, but this time with an army of the kids that Guts had killed because they were pseudo-apostles. He blamed the demon child for bringing these guys along with him for his monthly hauntings and spent the rest of the night cutting up the souls of children he'd already killed. By the time Guts gets to Rosine herself, he's done feeling any sort of way about the nature of the targets he was taking out. It wasn't his fault an apostle had turned kids into their pseudos, and it didn't matter if they were a child themselves. An apostle was an apostle, and Guts decided to exorcise this one without mercy. His battle with Rosine is sickening because he fights like a feral beast in it. He's willing to break through cocoons housing half-transformed babies and use them as distractions just to get to the Elf Queen. One of the most disturbing Guts panels from the manga is this one, when he douses himself with elf amniotic fluid to put out the fire engulfing his body, and comes out of the whole thing with intestines hanging in his mouth. Guts solidifies himself as a monster when he mortally wounds Rosine, and is willing to end her life completely, even after knowing she'll die regardless. The only thing that stopped him was an arrow from a knight working with the Holy Iron Chain Knights in tracking down Guts, who, after seeing the human bodies of Rosine's pseudos, were convinced that Guts was their man. He manages to escape his human pursuers, but his spiritual ones exist, and this is where we first meet Guts' inner beast of darkness. As he walks out of the misty valley, the spirits surround him, but instead of attacking like they usually would, they choose to taunt him this time instead. The dead spirits of this world are really good at figuring out their target's innermost fears and desires and using them to manipulate their thoughts and generate chaos within their hearts. Guts was feeling guilty about killing all those children. Even if they were collateral damage he couldn't possibly have avoided. He slaughtered scores of them, if not hundreds, and he was aware of the toll this would have on his soul were he ever destined for a place like heaven. Because he was bound for hell, being a branded one, he wasn't bothered much about a good afterlife for himself. He didn't particularly believe in one. But the spirits taunted him anyway because they knew he had a guilty conscience about it. As they did, they told him that the more he killed and tasted blood, the more he would crave it. And soon enough, hate will be the only thing driving his feet. He'd become a monster in a man's body. We see a wolf-like silhouette glowering over Guts' head. This beast of darkness is the manifestation of all of Guts' worst personality aspects. thoughts and feeling. It's not a real entity, but it's given form by the spirits that are trying to coax Guts into giving himself up to them. As they mock him for his weakness to his own malice, they propose that he could perhaps become just like Griffith by using the behelit he kept from the slug count, but that's where the Black Swordsman drew the line. He slashed through the spirits with Dragon Slayer, but his body was very weak, and their ploy had worked. As soon as Guts fell face first into the forest floor, they swarmed him in an effort to complete his sacrifice. The beast would have won, but it didn't, thanks to perhaps the most important presence in Guts' life since Casca, Puck. Guts got stuck with the elf in his search for the Snake Baron. He was at an inn where the Baron's goons were harassing Puck, and he beat them up to goad their master out. Saving Puck wasn't his intention, it was a coincidence, but one that would turn out to save his life on numerous occasions because of Puck's inherent nature. Puck is an elf. Elves possess immense healing powers in the Berserk verse. As soon as Puck joined Guts on his journey, healing and recovery became much less of an issue for him, because all he needed was a bit of elf dust. He was also handy in battle thanks to his Puck Spark ability, which could blind enemies and help Guts escape or cause a distraction in a pinch. But the reason why we would say Puck helped Guts retain his humanity is because he became a sounding board for it. Whenever Guts would do something brash, arrogant, insensitive, borderline evil, Puck would call him out for it and make him empathize with the situation instead. Guts always walked to the beat of his own drum, but Puck's presence made him a bit softer since his lonely days as the Black Swordsman. He didn't see this as a good thing, because Guts was still focused on his malice being the source of his strength and saw Puck as a literal bug. But when Puck saved him from being swarmed by the dead spirits and claimed that he was the only reason Guts was still alive, the swordsman had to laugh. He admitted that Puck had some medicinal value, kept him by his side willingly ever since, because he wanted the beast to see that he was him. He did things of his own accord, and wouldn't end up the way it thought he would. The beast would see. Though he never thanks Puck out loud for it, he's grateful for his presence in his life because Puck keeps his humanity grounded. Guts starts cracking jokes again, and when he returns to meet Rickett, Erica, and Goddo, Ricky can tell that Guts is still himself thanks to Puck's presence. He thanks the elf for it, and a lot of other coincidental things. A reunion wasn't what Guts came back for. He returned because although he knows he's got darkness within him, he has a flickering flame of brightness as well, and that's none other than Casca. Conviction, confrontation, and holding on to irreplaceable things. Guts reunites with Casca and meets Griffith again. Initially, Guts was extremely jumpy when Rickett told him Casca had escaped from their home. He blamed Rickett for letting such a thing happen and angrily demanded to know why he wasn't looking for her right at that moment. Erica started crying and calling him stupid because 1. She was the reason Casca escaped, and 2. Guts abandoned her in the first place. He abandoned all of them to go fight monsters, and this fact was expanded upon by Goddo. Rickett explained that the reason he couldn't fully commit to searching for Casca was because Goddo was dying. Not because he was sick or anything, it was just old age. Even in his old age, the blacksmith's eyes were sharp, and he could see Guts was breaking. Goddo called out Guts for holding on to his desire for vengeance and calling his lost comrades irreplaceable when he himself abandoned Casca all those years ago. He could sniff out Guts' fear, see the cracks that had developed in his psyche. Without ever needing to be told of its existence, Goddo could sense the Beast of Darkness's hold over Guts, and he wondered out loud how long he'd be able to keep up the fight before going insane. His sword and artificial arm were both in such terrible shape that they shouldn't have gotten like that with 10 years of usage. Goddo understood the gravity of Guts' situation, but he refused to believe the swordsman was doing any good for anyone else or himself by insisting to fight so relentlessly. He warned Guts that if he didn't reevaluate his approach, he'd break, and once again, Guts resisted this notion. Of course, he's justified in feeling the weight of what he experienced during the Eclipse. He's the only person that can sanely describe that horrifying scene to the world, and his reasons for hunting the apostles, however personal, are causing overall good to the world. But at the same time, as he was thinking about all this, he felt the beast's presence on his shoulder as it urged him to let the blood flow. Guts realized that hidden within the raging black flame of hatred was a tiny spark of hope, love, and protection, and that was Casca. He cursed himself for losing sight of what was important once again and came to the conclusion that though he might struggle at times, he'd never do the same thing again. Guts accepted that what Goddo said was right, and he was determined to make things right with his own strength. This time, when he fought apostles and such, it wouldn't be for the sake of his bloodlust, it would be for Casca's safety. Or at least that's what he decided on. He'd come to Goddo's hut thanks to a warning about her being in danger in the first place. Usually, Guts brushes off his demon child, but this time, it gave him a prophetic dream about Casca potentially being burnt at the stake as a suspected witch. He beseeched his father to head to the holy ground and save their mutual loved one, and Guts got the message loud and clear. After coming back to the hut and getting that important lecture, as well as upgrades to his armor and arsenal, Guts asked Rickett for clues to Casca's location and is off on his way. His parting words to Goddo were that he would rely on him again soon, and though the blacksmith is baffled by the swordsman's blindness to the fact that he was dying, he thinks to himself that it was just as well. He didn't expect anything else from Guts. and he was glad he could pass on one message to him before his death. As he was reforging the Dragon Slayer, which had turned out to be his last act in life, Godot handed Rickett two responsibilities. The first was Erica. He wanted the boy to look after her, and trusted that he would because he'd been Rickett's master these past 2 years. He knew the kid's pure nature. The second and more important thing for this video is the fact that he told Rickett to tell Guts not to turn out like himself. Godot didn't regret his life after he met Erica, but up until then, he was pretty aimless, being a blacksmith for the sake of being a blacksmith. It was through fatherhood that he found meaning and contentedness, and he wished the same for the lug that used to mooch off him all the time. It's sad that Rickett couldn't pass on that message to Guts in time, because maybe his life would have turned out differently otherwise. However, we would say that the meaning of these words was conveyed to him regardless, because now, Guts was not as insistent on being alone in his journey. He was open to relying on others, once again, and that doesn't include just Puck. As he was making his way towards St. Albion, Guts came across a young thief called Isidro, who was trying to fend for himself in a village populated by bandits and Kushan invaders. Isidro was doing pretty well with outsmarting the bandits, but he wasn't sure he could do anything about the scores of Kushan killers that had arrived to decimate that place. He was hiding behind a water barrel when Guts casually strolled into town, destroying the Kushan, and kept moving towards that holy city. Isidro was highly impressed by Guts' insane feats, and it makes sense that he sought him out to become his protege. The funny thing here is, as we told you guys earlier on in the video, Isidro idolized Guts before he knew him, and for all the time he knew him, he never figured out Guts was the 100-man slayer. This is because Guts didn't really mention his old life a lot around his new comrades, but the fact that he was willing to take on new comrades was a miracle in and of itself. Guts' chase of Casca made him rely on Luca and her girls, Isidro and his stone-throwing abilities, Puck for obvious reasons, and even Serpico and Farnese. When the Holy Iron Chain Knights captured him the first time, he managed to escape and put the fear of God into Farnese's heart. She experienced just a single night of terrors with him and was convinced that he needed to die for her to preserve her dignity. Serpico was just pissed that Guts had made his master feel bad twice, and he also wanted to fight Guts one-on-one. He cornered him at one point when they were both attacking a heretic's cave in St. Albion, and they had a pretty epic exchange which ended as a draw because of reasons out of their control. But once the blood flow of the dead began, all emotional enmities were kept aside because the two opposing forces were made plainly clear. Humanity and flesh-eating, soul-sucking blobs of evil, spirit-infused blood. Before he closed in on his destination, Guts was visited by the Skull Knight, who warned him of what was about to occur in the Holy City. You can check out our video on the Incarnation Ceremony for a more detailed account of this demonic ritual, which is worse than the Eclipse. But the point is, Skull Knight warned Guts that the moment he stepped into the city, a countdown of sorts would begin. Both him and Casca were branded individuals, and up until now, only one of them had been out in the world. Casca was in Godot's cave for the most part, so her brand was neutralized as long as she stayed there. But once she got out, she became a beacon for evil spirits, quite like Guts. And unlike him, she couldn't defend herself. That job was taken up by the Demon Child, who protected his mother for the entire month that she was in St. Albion from evil spirits, heretics, the Iron Maiden, the blood flow of the dead, and even a pseudo-apostle's flames. The last four happened after Guts came into the city as well, which turned St. Albion into a hotspot for evil creatures to gather to. What ensued was a one-sided massacre of the entire refugee camp outside the city, and the clergy within the Tower of Rebirth, as the blood flow of the dead gathered every last morsel of human life and channeled it into the egg of the perfect world's body. In the midst of the madness of the ceremony, Guts was fighting off a squad of pseudo-apostles as well as the blood flow. But this time, he had backup, and this time, his goals were different. He was laser-focused on saving Casca, and as soon as he got her to safety, his entire demeanor changed. Guts had been tense for the better part of the last couple of years. He was tense because he felt like he had to be that way. Only recently had he accepted that his malice wasn't his only motivator, and that Casca was what kept him alive as well. So when he hugged her, he felt as though everything had become right with the world again. With Serpico, Isidro, Farnese and Puck beside him, he led all of them through that night of horrors as a beacon of shining light. When morning came, everyone was shocked that they'd managed to survive, and Serpico and Farnese expressed their gratitude to Guts for the same. And then he found out why Skull Knight had told him that the one he was seeking would appear where he was headed. At the break of dawn, the egg of the perfect world hatched, and from within emerged Griffith. Not in his demonic form, but how he looked before. There were differences, of course. One look at his eyes would tell you he was a demon. But seeing the sight of his former leader's old body made Guts forget his malice for a moment, and that enraged him. When Guts and Griffith reunited on the Hill of Swords, Rickett had erected as a memorial to their fallen comrades. He was in disbelief that after everything he'd done, Griffith didn't feel a shred of regret or shame over his own actions. Guts couldn't believe he forgot he hated a man as reprehensible as him for even a split second, and he tried to take it out on Griffith on that hill, but he was stopped by two crucial factors, Casca and Zod. The Immortal One engaged Guts in a duel as soon as he tried to get to Griffith, hindering his approach. Their battle ended up inadvertently putting Casca in harm's way, who was shockingly protected by none other than Griffith. The Falcon then flew off with Zod, telling Guts he intended to realize his dream with no one to hold him back this time. The Black Swordsman wanted to follow him, but he knew he had more important things to look after now, and this is where the topic of his humanity comes in. We've gotten a little far ahead of the canonical timeline, so let's back it up a little bit. As soon as Griffith resurfaced in the physical world, the scene was infiltrated by Kushan invaders being led by Silat, who was tracking the Falcon, and Zod, who was doing the same thing for different reasons. Where Silat had been commanded to capture the Falcon and bring him to Ganishka, Zod had been summoned by Griffith himself to become the first soldier of his new army. The God Hand member simply flew off into the morning sky on the palm of the Immortal One, and Guts didn't have enough time to process this development, because he had bigger fish to fry. Even though Zod and Griffith had left, the Kushan had not, and their assault separated Guts from his temporary party. Still, he managed to hold on to the one person that mattered most to him, and escape with her as best he could. Guts had to tie up Casca with a rope to keep her from running off on their travels, but it was also necessary so he could fight without worrying. With another brand of sacrifice with them on their journey, Guts and Puck had become rather busy fighting dead spirits. Twice the power meant thrice the numbers attracted to the brand's presence, and things were frankly getting overwhelming for the two of them because when they weren't fighting enemies, they were busy chasing Casca down. The branded girl would keep running away from Guts for one reason or the other, and the pair decided that they couldn't do this forever. Guts was a soul warrior, and Casca clearly couldn't keep living like this for the rest of her life. So Puck suggests that they go to his home, Elfhelm, where both Guts and Casca would be able to live peacefully at the very least. They know from Godot's ore mine that elfin presence discourages apostle attacks, so Guts decides to take Puck up on his offer for Casca's sake. Little did he know just how desperate he was for such a breakthrough, because shortly after deciding on their destination, Guts commits perhaps the blackest sin of his entire life. As you might have figured out by now, Guts is a good guy on the whole, but he's not flawless. He has his moments of extreme rage, where his malicious thoughts consume him to the point he sometimes doesn't even know what he's doing himself. These thoughts have taken the shape of the beast of darkness in his inner psyche, and this beast keeps getting louder with every passing day. See, Guts wants to do good things, protect Casca and all of that, but he's resisting his true desire to take his revenge on Griffith by doing so. That dissonance keeps feeding the beast's hold over him, as he can smell the moments where Guts becomes weak and pounces upon those moments to make him do malicious things. Case in point, the time Guts nearly assaulted Casca himself. One day, as the three of them made camp, Casca ran off as usual and Guts went looking for her, only this time, she did something out of the ordinary. Usually, Casca didn't have the sense to wipe the drool off her chin, let alone defend herself, and through no fault of her own, might we add. But this time, she came across a group of bandits that tried to take advantage of her, and she somehow managed to defend herself and kill all of them. When Guts saw her naked, covered in blood and holding a sword, he couldn't hold himself any longer. He'd held himself back in the cave 2 years ago because he knew this wasn't the right thing to do. But with Casca having killed 4 dudes in his absence with that kind of precision, what else would he think other than, she's back? It should have been a fleeting thought, but he held onto it and forced himself onto her. He was about to ravage her and even bit into her bosom, hard, before realizing he was being egged on by the beast. When he heard the beast tell him to rip her head off and violate her like Griffith did in order to become strong like him, he came back to his senses and saw just how far he'd fallen as a man. Guts was perplexed by his own actions, and this is why he decided to accept companions on his journey. When Puck showed up with Isidro, Serpico, and Farinase in tow, he didn't even resist his suggestion of them joining up with the duo. He simply accepted, because he recognized that his humanity was slipped, and he needed to protect Casca from himself somehow. Guts had just gotten an irreplaceable thing back, and he never wanted to lose it again. So he took all the help he thought he needed to hold on to Casca, and in the process, ended up becoming more human again. Guts' travels with his party softened the burden on his shoulders because now there were people to help him take care of things. Farinase secularized herself and came to serve Guts because she thought he would show her the truth of the world. She was assigned to be Casca's caretaker at first, and then grew into a prodigious mage on her own merit. Serpico initially joined because he was Farnase's manservant, but also because he wanted to keep an eye on Guts. His fighting skills were a great help in the Black Swordsman party's travels. The same could be said for Isidro, though to a lesser degree because he was a swordsman in training after all. Guts agreed to train him as long as he pulled his weight in the group, and that this young man did. He was also grateful to Isidro because the kid was crucial to keeping Casca alive and safe during the conviction arc. It's ironic that his most inhuman moment made him realize his humanity, but hey, that's how Berserk works, baby. It's layers within layers within layers, like a croissant, but make it margarine-based because you know, that's evil. Guts has 2 primary motivators in life now, protecting Casca and killing Griffith. But after the Hill of Swords and what he did to her, he chooses to focus on the former. Guts realizes what kind of a man he turns into when he focuses on his revenge, and he doesn't want to be that man. His new friends don't replace his old ones, but they certainly fill the holes left behind by them within Guts' heart, and he's grateful for that. We suppose it's just Kentaro Miura's style to give his protagonists a measure of relief before burying them underneath a mountain of adversity and pain. Because it turns out that the greatest tool that Guts can ever possibly use in his struggle against the God Hand is one that amplifies every malign aspect of his personality and mind, making him a danger to the very people he wants to protect. The beginning of the end, Guts and the Berserker armor. After joining forces with his new crew and assigning them their duties, Guts sets out his new party toward their destination, Skellig Island, the rock that's home to numerous mages and magical creatures, including Puck. The only problem is, Puck is a forgetful fella who can barely remember the outlines of people he's only seen once, let alone recall complex travel routes. So they have to search for passage to Skellig Island the old-fashioned way, through exploration. On their travels, they come across a mountain near a place called Enoch Village. An old man warns them not to go that way because it's home to trolls, but the group ignores his warning and goes into the mountains anyway. As they're resting, Farnese and Casca are nearly kidnapped by a troll. Guts and Serpico weren't close enough to kill it. They were clearing up some confusion, so to speak, so Isidro decides to step in and take care of it. He overestimates himself and nearly gets killed when a witch appears from out of nowhere and saves all of their hides. This witch's name is Shirka, and she and her elf companion Ivalera become indispensable members of Guts' party from this point onward. Why, you ask? Well, Shirka is a witch after all. Her knowledge about things related to magic and particularly the astral world, which was connected to everything Guts was hunting, was invaluable to him. But more than that, she goes on to become one of the only people Guts actively relies on to hold himself back. And that's a big thing. When she comes across the group, Shirka saves them from a pack of trolls and tells them to leave the forest immediately, but decides to keep an eye on them when she sees Guts and Casca. She can sense their brands causing a distortion in the natural flow of life within the region, and she thinks she should keep watch over them to protect her mistress from them. Turns out, her mistress was guiding Guts and the rest to her mansion, because she knew that this was an important interaction for the fate of the world. The mage Flora had been alive since before the world forgot about its spiritual energy. She's friends with Skull Knight, who's 1,000 years old himself, and she possesses immense knowledge about things like the Behelit, causality, and the God Hand. She also knows that she's about to die in a matter of a few days, and she doesn't want to leave her disciple alone in this cruel world, so after Guts and the rest are done being welcomed by her golems, she gives them a proposal. Before coming across the mansion, Guts' party came across a troll attack survivor called Morgan. They kind of found the mansion thanks to Morgan in the first place, and so repay that. And to repay that, Flora tasks Guts and the rest with the job of helping Enoch Village by clearing out the trolls. In exchange, she offers Guts the promise of a roof, safe from evil spirits, a talisman that dampens the effects of the brands on his and Casca's body, and most of all, answers. Guts wanted to know what the Behelit was, figure out a way to kill them the next time he saw them. Flora told him things weren't as simple as he thought they were, because a Behelit wasn't a simple key, and the God Hand weren't simple beings. She explained to him that a Behelit could only be used by a person destined to use it, and it was sure to happen when they craved their power the most. He fervently wished that the Behelit in Guts' possession wasn't his, and that he was merely its carrier, because she understood the implications of what would happen if it was. The Black Swordsman has been taunted into using his Behelit in exchange for power many times in the series, often by his own psyche, but once by another entity he's seeking to destroy. We'll get to that in a bit, but coming back to Guts' questions, Flora understood why he was asking all this and acknowledged the sheer magnitude of the burden he was shouldering. She apologized for not being of help beyond what she'd already told him. Guts told her to not stress it because he was already thankful for the talismans. Little did he know he'd soon be thankful for another one of Flora's devices, but also equally endangered by it. What started as a troll cleanup mission turned into a rescue operation because once they reached Enoch Village, Casca and Farnese got kidnapped once more, and this time the trolls were able to make off with them to their lair. That place, Clipparth, the astral world's region of darkness. Turns out, ever since Griffith's incarnation, the physical and astral worlds had started overlapping in certain areas of the world, and in the region near Enoch Village, the overlapping was so intense that Clipparth had appeared in the real world. Guts put in a shift during this mission, taking down several trolls and a massive ogre, but he wasn't prepared to handle what was waiting for him inside of Clipparth. We aren't talking about more trolls and ogres. No, those he was happy to see, because he could finally let off some steam without anyone judging him for it. We're talking about Slan, the other God Hand member that has an express interest in Guts' life. Slann has kept tabs on Guts ever since she first saw him during the Eclipse, because she finds his resisting nature irresistible. She's expressed a desire to have him become one of theirs on multiple occasions, and now that he'd entered her domain, she just couldn't resist having a go at recruiting the lad. Slann partially manifests into the physical world via Troll Guts, and proceeds to strangle Guts in position as she gives him her proposal. She urges him to use the behelit he keeps carrying and join their ranks to get the power to defeat Griffith, and leaves him with a chest wound that goes beyond his mortal flesh and injures his very soul. Guts would have likely had a real tough time trying to get out of this situation alive had Skull Knight not arrived. Thanks to the distraction of the foe with the Inhuman's arrival, Guts was able to blast his cannon into Slann's guts and then run her through with Dragon Slayer, which, as it turns out, is capable of harming all sorts of astral entities, including the God Hand. Slann isn't dead because of this turn of events by any means. She's a profound astral entity, only partially entering the physical world after all. But she does want Guts even more than before now, and she leaves him with a revolting kiss and the promise to meet him again. The Black Swordsman is panicking after her departure because it triggered the collapse of the cave he was standing in, and once again, Guts had to rely on Skull Knight to save him. He was getting a little tired of relying on his fellow strugglers so much, but he couldn't complain because he knew he'd be dead otherwise. Guts nearly collapsed and passed out after returning because, like we mentioned earlier, Slann injured his soul. Such wounds do not heal easily, even with elf magic, and they cause such immense pain that the person experiencing it should barely be conscious. Guts managed to walk on after getting emergency first aid because he was used to being in indescribable amounts of pain. But when he returned to Flora's mansion, he realized he desperately needed something else to help him in his fight against Griffith. This is because the partial manifestation of a God Hand member injured him this much. What had happened if all of them attacked together? But more than that, when the Black Swordsman party returned to Flora's mansion, they found it on fire because, you guessed it, Griffith attacked it with his apostles. Guts was unaware of this, but while he was out looking for a means to restore Casca's mind, Griffith was busy posing as Midland's liberator. In truth, he was preparing for the advent of the great roar of the astral world, and one of its crucial steps was to kill Flora because of her immense magical powers. Griffith sent an entire unit of his war demons to accomplish this task, and Guts realized really quick into the encounter that he needed armor at the very least. This wasn't just because he was facing Grunbeld, it was also just a general requirement. He was getting thrashed about like in his first fight with Zod without it. So, Shirker gave him the best and worst armor in the world, the Berserker armor. You can watch our video on Guts vs Grunbeld or any of our videos on the Berserker armor to find out why that's the case in detail, because here we'll only touch upon the major ways in which it impacts Guts' story going forward. The first is it puts a rapid clock on Guts' life counter. The Black Swordsman's life was one filled with conflict, and pain was bound to be a part of his life, no doubt. He'd lived most of his life with it, after all. But the Berserker armor was different, in that it only temporarily removed his pain for the time it was being actively used. The moment Guts stopped drawing on its power, it hit him with the cumulative effects of all of his injuries and limit-breaking stunts, of which there were too many to count. His first use of the armor left him incapacitated for weeks, and it took multiple rounds of magical healing to get him back on his feet. When he does, his body ages rapidly, because it incurs all that damage at once, and the proof is in the pudding. After one use of the Berserker armor, Guts developed a white streak of hair on the front of his head, which has never gone away. He becomes gaunter and more hollow-looking with every use of the armor, and to top it all off, it's also killing him slowly. The eyesight deteriorates at first. You lose your sense of taste. You can't hear things all too well. Your hands shiver when they shouldn't. The Berserker armor slowly robs its user of all of their senses until there's nothing left but a lifeless husk, and then it consumes even that. The previous user of the armor was killed by it, as in he died fighting in the armor, and there was no one to pull him out of it. That man was Skull Knight, and he was the one who warned Guts not to use the armor too often, lest he lose himself to it. But Guts has never been the listening type, so, of course, he keeps using the armor despite the best advice from his party members and otherwise. Eventually, he reaches a point where he can barely make out outlines of a person's body, and he can't even hold Dragon Slayer without bandaging it to his palm and using the Berserker armor simultaneously. But to make things even worse for him, the more he uses the armor, the worse it makes his mental state because of the way the Berserker armor works. It feeds off its user's inner malice, his hatred, his rage. It amplifies every emotion Guts doesn't want to pop up around his friends, and gives life to his beast of darkness in a way he can't ignore. The Berserker armor's helmet design is the same as the head of Guts' beast of darkness. It was in the shape of a skull before that, because that was the form Skull Knight's inner darkness took back when he was a human being. By feeding on such emotions, it also ends up triggering them inadvertently, and one of the most dangerous tasks of the Black Swordsman party becomes controlling Guts when he goes berserk. This is because in that state, he'll kill anything that moves, be it animals, apostles, magical beasts, or his own friends. And even after he's pulled out of it, it'll cause those negative emotions to fester within Guts' waking thoughts, so much so that if he even remotely thinks of the people he wants to kill, the armor will jump at its chance to take over his body. And yet, the Berserker armor is absolutely essential to Guts' journey, because it's the only thing that can stand up to entities like the God Hand and take away the human limitation of pain and fear in lieu of a head-on battle for the ages. The fact that Guts was able to crack Grunbel's seemingly unbreakable skin is proof enough, but he also goes on to prove the necessity of the armor many times over in his travel to his destination. In Guts' opinion, the Berserker armor is like a necessary evil, and he chooses to wield it because he trusts in his companions. Shirka is one of two people who can pull him out of his frenzied state, and the girl only gets better at casting spells as the days go by. The other person we'll get to in a bit, but let's now talk about the biggest reason Guts wanted to keep this dangerous tool on himself, saving Casca's mind. Path to redemption with demonic obstacles and dubious promise. Guts' journey to Elfhelm. We've noted before in this video that the reason Guts accepts companions in the first place is because he was afraid of what he could end up doing to Casca. After that incident in the forest, he felt as though he was a threat to her as well, so he made his peace with someone else becoming her savior, as long as he was there to see it happen. All Guts cared about was her safety, and all he hoped for was that she could one day become normal again. He knew that the Berserker armor was a risky addition to his arsenal because of the way it worked, but he was willing to take that risk because he was doing it for Casca. The first time Shirka pulled him out of his frenzy, she did it by invoking Casca's name, so you can tell just how important she's become to him. This is why when Skull Knight tells him that there is in fact a way to bring her sanity back, he leaps at the opportunity because to him, this could mean redemption. Guts wanted to erase the stain he'd put on their relationship by forcing himself on her when she couldn't even think for herself. He'd spent a lot of time and put in the work to build relationships with other people once again because he recognized his flaws and wanted to be a better man for Casca's sake. He was willing to do whatever it took to get her back, though when he found out he was already headed in the right direction, he became the most optimistic he'd been in a very long time. After warning him about the effects of the Berserker armor, Skull Knight told Guts that if he managed to make it to Puck's homeland of Elfhelm, then that realm's legendary monarch, Enafabuku, could restore her sanity with their magic. Guts was delighted to hear this and thanked Skull Knight for this ray of hope, but the wandering wraith hit him with a patented warning as well. He told Guts that even if they managed to make it to Elfhelm through the ordeal that was about to befall them, it won't be so simple as things going back to how they were. There was no guarantee that what he wanted would be what she wanted, and besides, Skull Knight also fed the Beast of Darkness by telling Guts that if he continued on this path, he'd not only come across more apostles, but the man leading them would mostly likely be Griffith. We're immediately shown what he means by the first half of that sentence thanks to the arrival of the Moonlight Boy, because he's the second person that can bring Guts out of a frenzied state. Nobody knows this, at least not at this point in the story, but when Griffith was incarnated into the physical world, he was supposed to come into it solo. Instead, he was incarnated into the body of the Demon Child, who had been swallowed by the egg of the perfect world. This ended up creating this unique situation where, while Griffith was pretty much heartless in every other occasion, his body would move automatically to protect those the Demon Child loved, mainly Casca. This is why he unconsciously protected Casca at the Hill of Swords and then awkwardly flew away, because he realized he wasn't the one controlling that action. And every night of the full moon, Griffith loses complete control over his body by transforming into the Moonlight Boy, who then travels the dragon path to show up wherever its mother is at the time. You can find out more about the relationship between Guts and the Moonlight Boy from our video on Will Guts Kill the Moonlight Boy, because a lot of this has been discussed in a lot more detail over there. But the reason we bring up this point now is, like we mentioned a few moments ago, the Moonlight Boy is the only other person that can stop Guts' Berserker rampages, and this was proven the second time Guts used the Berserker armor. He was going ham on Daiba's Pishaka Ghana, and while he held back initially, he soon gave in to the armor's call. In his Berserker state, Guts absolutely savaged a Makara, a beast that was said to have enough power to destroy 10 warships all by itself. When he was done with every target attacking their shoreline retreat, he turned his attention toward his friends as the only living things in his vicinity. Guts was about to strike them, and there was nothing Shirka could do about it, because she'd already been rejected entry into Guts' psyche by the armor. Like we mentioned earlier, the more Guts used the armor, the stronger stronger its grip over him became, and the chances that Shirka could get him out of that state without being in contact with him reduced drastically. This is where the Moonlight Boy becomes so important. As a profound astral entity, bearing the power and body of a God Hand member, the Moonlight Boy had immense spiritual powers. Navigating the dragon path of the astral world is no easy feat. Even Shirka, with all her spiritual prowess, can't do it without invoking a ritual. But for the Moonlight Boy, it's a walk in the park. He dissuaded a Pishaka from attacking him and Casca with nothing but a look, and when Guts tried to attack his own friends, while including him as well, he travelled into his father's psyche astrally, calm him down. Once he managed to do that, Shirka pulled him out, and she wasn't smartened up to what had actually happened because even Guts didn't understand it. He definitely knew the silhouette he saw didn't belong to Shirka, but he couldn't make out why the kid would help him, or even how it could. He left that question for another day, but perhaps he should have pursued it then, because it would have saved him a world of pain. The Moonlight Boy's appearance brought joy to Casca that none of her comrades had seen from her in a long time. She started acting like its mother, instinctively, because deep down, she knew that was the truth. The boy even hesitated to talk to Guts initially because all his father had done was chase him away. But when he saw that wasn't the case anymore, he climbed onto Guts' back and almost fell onto his stack of throwing knives, giving us the only moment where Guts, Casca and their child posed together as a family. Even the fact that her behavior around this kid reminded him of the demon child didn't send alarm bells ringing off in Guts' head, and that's a testament to how thick in the head he can be at times. This was one of the worst things he could overlook, however, because, as we told you earlier, it opened him up to a lot of pain down the line. After surviving the attack of the Pishaka Ghana, Guts and his crew headed to the city of Britannis because to get to Elfhelm, they needed a ship, and Farnace was the only one out of all of them that could arrange that kind of passage for them. So they went back to her hometown, and after a short while where she struggled with what her family wanted for her life and what she wanted from her life, Farnace managed to get Guts the vessel he needed to continue his journey. But getting to her betrothed Roderick's seahorse was an ordeal in and of itself, because of the conditions that afflicted Britannis as soon as Guts' party arrived. Initially, Guts spent the day looking for an inn to stay at and looking out for Shirka. The young mage had been overwhelmed by the cruelty of humans, and had been annoyed enough by Isidro to break away from the party and go have her own mini-adventure. Guts kept tracking her from a distance, keeping a watchful eye on her, and that made Shirka realize that she did have a place in this noisy world. It was beside Guts, as his accomplice and the only person that could save him from the disasters of the Berserker armor. Once they got that all sorted out, they went to the Vandimian palace to retrieve Farnace, who at the time wanted to stay back with her family in exchange for the ship. Their arrival was most fortunate, because at around the same time, the location, which was hosting a ball for many important Western nobles, was invaded by the Kushan Emperor, Ganishka. Ganishka was an apostle that can manipulate his true form using sorcery, turning himself into mist that blankets the battlefields, allowing him to track whatever moves within it, and covertly move his own forces as well. That's what he tried to do here too, by interrupting the ball with his tiger, Pishaka. The plan was to kill them all in one fell swoop before Griffith's army could arrive. There was just one problem. Ganishka didn't anticipate Guts and his party to be present as well. As a force experienced with fighting magical beasts, they made short work of the ballroom fiasco, and convinced Farnace to join them again. Guts, making her realize her importance to the group, played a huge role in this, and so did the fact that he scored a win over Serpico. The pair had always been amicable with each other, but only as much as they needed to be. The truth was, Serpico hated Guts for changing Farnace so much, and he wanted her away from him as soon as possible. He was partially responsible for Farnace's decision to remain behind, and he challenged Guts to a proper duel, to which his reply was, finally. The Black Swordsman had been itching to settle his score with Serpico because they'd had skirmishes twice, and each time it was a draw. This time, he finished the job and convinced the Herald of Arms that he didn't wish for Farnace to be harmed, and would do everything in his power to keep things that way. With this renewed understanding, they set off with everyone that was needed for the voyage towards the harbour, where Roderick's ship awaited them. However, this is where they ran into a new problem: the Emperor himself. In an effort to clear the harbour of the Kushan Daka and Pishaka swarming Britannis, the Black Swordsman party used some rather powerful magic. This drew the attention of the Kushan wizard general Daiba first, who attacked Guts and Serpico with the gigantic sea serpent Pishaka called Kundalini. The pair managed to work even better together now that they were on the same page about things, and with Shirka's assistance, Guts and Serpico defeated Daiba. As soon as this happened, Ganishka appeared in front of the party and deduced that Guts wasn't on Griffith's side, at the very least. He liked the way the Black Swordsman fought, and gave him a one-time offer to join forces. Guts being Guts, he rejected the offer, and was forced to fight the mighty Kushan Emperor practically all by himself. Serpico and the rest couldn't even hope to stand up to Ganishka's lightning, but with the Berserker armor, Guts at least had hope. His hope turned into a chance in the most unexpected fashion when, falling from the sky, charred and half-stunned, came his solution to killing a thundercloud. Zod. The Immortal One and the Black Swordsman crossed paths for the first time since Flora's mansion, but for once, they had bigger fish to fry, and their target was the same man. When the Immortal Immortal One flew off after warning Guts not to interfere. He responded by clinging to Zod's back as he took off. Guts threatened Zod with decapitation if he didn't cooperate with his plan, and the Immortal thought back to the prophecy he was given by Griffith's oracle. Right before the Battle of Retinus, Zod was told that he would have to choose between fighting the sword that once cut his flesh or making it his own weapon. He realized what was meant by those words in these moments and agreed to becoming Guts' vehicle one time only. Thanks to Shirka's astral perception, Guts is able to locate Ganishka's weak spot and thrust Dragonslayer through it, with Zod charging at it in full speed. The effort leaves both of them cooked to a crisp, but he gets the job done. Guts' sword is powerful enough to cut the flesh of god hands. Ganishka's spectral form was child's play for it. After coming crashing down to the earth, the two mortal enemies square up to settle a score that started at the beginning of the series, but priorities put a pause on those plans. Zod needed to get his forces in order and clean up Ganishka's demon attack force. Guts needed to get his comrades and get the hell out of Retinus. For a brief moment, Zod considered ending Guts there and then, because he asked him if Griffith was close by, and the Immortal threatened to unleash the full might of his war demons upon him if he pressed with his queries. But Guts knew better than to argue. He got up on Roderick's ship and off they went towards Elfhelm, giving us one of the most frustrating boat arcs in manga history. The sea voyage to Elfhelm was pretty uneventful besides two major occurrences. The first was the Great Roar of the Astral World. Even far from the epicenter, which was Wyndham City, the people aboard the Seahorse could feel that the world they previously knew had come to an end when a strange light flashed over their bodies. Guts knew something was wrong because his behelit was reacting to this light and his brand was bleeding unusually, but he didn't know exactly what it was. He'd understand once he reaches Elfhelm. The second major occurrence was his battle with the sea god, which ended up confirming to us that yes, Guts is ready to take down god-level astral entities with a little bit of help. You see, soon after they set sail, Roderick's ship came under attack from the most annoying Berserk character since Adon, Captain Bonebeard. Roderick was able to show off his seafaring skills to Guts and earn his approval by dealing with 3 attacking ships with his sole vessel, but unfortunately for them, they didn't exactly manage to defeat Bonebeard for good. Instead, they pushed him into the jaws, whiskers, of a malign, ancient deity awakened by the great roar of the astral world, the sea god. This entity was monstrous large, about as big as Ganishka in his Shiva form, and that's friggin' massive to begin with. Whatever organic life it consumed, it made a part of its body, which it then sent out into the world to bring him more food. These whiskers could grow to be as large as krakens, and it's clear that these people aren't exactly dead after having been consumed by the sea god. They've become corrupted parts of this massive entity. Guts and his party managed to repel one attack from Bonebeard's sea god-powered crew, only to arrive at an island where they're attacked by him again. It's even worse than that, actually, because turns out this island is very close to the sea god's home, and every person on it has already become a part of his body. The only person who hasn't is a girl called Isma, and therein lies the group's silver lining. This is because Isma is half Merrow, and the Merrows of the ocean surrounding that island were natural enemies of the sea god. With her help, Guts and the crew were able to defeat the malign deity, but not after putting in some hectic work. Guts went berserk trying to deal with Bonebeard's second assault, and was once again stopped from rampaging by the Moonlight Boy's presence. Shirka decided to connect her psyche to his before he set out to fight the sea god's actual body, because at least that way, she'd be able to keep him from losing his mind completely, allowing Guts to draw the full power of the Berserker armor minus the berserkness. The pair venture into his lair by themselves, and Guts manages to make his way into the sea god's chest cavity, where his heart resided. It took him a lot of struggling to kill the damn thing because each heartbeat felt like a sonic boom was being slapped across Guts' face, and he was flying blind after a point, but Isma and her Merrow sisterhood pulled through just in time to give Guts the opening he needed. Their song disturbed the sea god long enough for the Black Swordsman to pierce its heart, killing it almost instantly, but now he had a new problem. Guts was stuck within the sea god's inner body, and the damn thing was able to sink to the bottom of the ocean. Once again, Moonlight Boy's spectral body guides him to safety, and the Merrows take care of the rest. Guts wonders why the boy keeps helping him, and while everyone else is off searching for the kid, he's the only one who notices him ride the branches of the world tree and fly off into the distance like a shooting star. It's a damn shame that Guts never actually asked the question he should be asking at the moment they're relevant, because it would just make his life so much simpler to bear with. But then again, Berserk wouldn't be half as interesting as it is, would it? With the addition of Isma to their ranks, who joins them because her home is now deserted and also Isidro insists upon it, Guts now has a sizable crew of people he can rely upon. Barnasay and Shirka, the two mages, Serpico, Isidro and Roderick, who are capable fighters, Puck and Ivalera, who are their residential medics, even General Azan, Barnasay's former vice commander, turns out to be a part of his voyage, and Azan is a man Guts respects a lot because of his skill, despite his old age. With company like this, it isn't long enough before the Black Swordsman party reaches their destination, Scalig Island, Puck's home, and the only place in the world that could fix Casca. Their welcome at Elfhelm wasn't a warm one, because the island's mages were rather weary of the world's developments and wanted to avoid entertaining problematic guests at all costs. Guts and his friends had to fight through an enchanted pumpkin field, several scarecrows, and a giant fiery wicker man that was as big as any monster Guts had ever seen. He took it down in one fell swoop, but it ended up setting the field on fire and brought the mages out of hiding because they didn't expect these humans to put up such an effective resistance to their magic. Just as it looked like a fight was about to break out, an old man riding an even older goat trotted onto the scene, and with nothing but a mere gesture of his hand, made it rain all over the plains. This man's name is Gedfring. He's a great guru of Elfhelm, one of its highest magical authorities, but more importantly, he's an old friend of Skull Knight's. Gedfring doesn't reveal this info in the beginning, because he's more concerned with getting his guests settled in. He and Guts exchanged information about the current happenings of the world and the extent to which Griffith was involved with it. Gedfring explained the what and how of what happened that day the strange light engulfed all of Earth. He broke down how the Great Roar works, how they were all now within a giant interstice, and how that was the reason Guts and the rest were facing more magical enemies than evil ones these days. Having given that answer, Gedfring expects one in return, so he wants Guts to tell him the why of all of this. He's able to glean that the Black Swordsman and the false Falcon are related somehow. Heck, even Flora could see that it was Griffith who was responsible for carving the brand of sacrifice into Guts' neck, and she wasn't even a great guru, well, officially speaking. We're sure she was on the same level, if not above it, but the point remains. The powerful mages of the world know what Femto has done, but they lack the context behind his actions, so Guts gives it to them, though he never expected to be the one explaining Griffith's actions. He says that Griffith's goal is to acquire his own kingdom at all costs, but once he'd done that, he'd keep going until he owned the whole universe. Once Griffith accomplished a goal, his next move was towards something bigger. He'd keep soaring higher and higher, because that was the Griffith Guts knew, the White Falcon. Gedfring shudders to think of the immense desire of this man and the things he did to gain his powers. He rightfully points out that because Griffith couldn't realize his dreams because of the world, he changed the world itself and made it so that only he could rule over it as the absolute. Everyone gets a better understanding of what they're dealing with, and it's an important conversation to have, yes, but not as important as getting Casca help. Once Guts was done with the Q&A, he begged to be taken to the Flower Storm monarch. Turns out she was serving him and his friends tea and cookies all this time, because the mage introduced to him as Danan, the domestic, was actually Hana Fubuku. Being an extremely powerful spiritual entity, Danan knows the purpose of Guts' visit and agrees to help him as well, but gives him a warning similar to Skull Knight's. Guts accepts the consequences of this decision as long as it cured Casca, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel the progress he'd made. That night, as Casca entered the Corridor of Dreams, Guts celebrated with Roderick and Serpico because his quest was finally over. He toiled through blood, mud, troll guts, and worse to get to this point. Serpico admitted his reservations about Guts in front of Roderick, but the three men were able to have a quiet drink like only men could, and it gave Guts a sense of relief. Soon, Casca would be back to her old self, and everything would be normal, or so he hoped. The Black Swordsman had become wiser and better at listening than the time he first set off to fight apostles, and one thing was still eating at his head: the claim that Skull Knight made about his destination. When Skull Knight told Guts he'd find what he was seeking at Elfhelm, he also warned him that once he got it, it wasn't necessary that his desires would line up with Casca's. Guts learnt that truth the harsh way, and when he realized that even though she was back to being herself again, Casca could probably never lay eyes upon him again. The Corridor of Dreams ritual was able to help Casca break down the mental barriers she'd set up to shield herself from the trauma of the Eclipse, but now that that had happened, her memories were cursed. Whenever she recalled something or someone from her past even remotely connected to the Eclipse, she'd break down in a panic, and it was especially worse around Guts. For some reason, just looking at the Black Swordsman reminded Casca of that hellscape, but we think we know why. Guts tried to assault her during her mindless Elaine days. It's very likely that her mind has correlated the act of getting violated itself with the Eclipse, considering that's what broke it in the first place. And now whenever it sees Guts, it goes into overdrive, bringing all that pain back to the forefront. Somehow, Guts made his peace with even that, because to him, the fact that Casca was safe was all that mattered. He'd give her all the space she needed to recover and heal properly before they could properly see each other again, because his job was done in a way. He told himself he'd find Casca a cure and protect her for the rest of his life, and he managed to do the harder thing of the two. Now, all he had to do was stay by her side, even if it was as her shadow. So, Guts spent some time doing a bit of self-searching and finding out answers to questions he didn't even know he needed to be asking. Even at a point where he couldn't properly see out of his one good eye, Guts never gave up his 100 sword swings routine that he developed as a child. Since he was 6 years old, this practice had been like a prayer for him. Just now, he was praying to find a way to get Casca to stop fearing him, so he didn't exactly appreciate Skull Knight interrupting him, but he didn't exactly have anything else to do anyway. So he entertained his personal harbinger of misfortune. Guts taught Skull Knight by claiming his warnings were unfounded because he managed to make it to Elfhelm without losing more pieces of himself. The Wraith called it luck, to which Guts quickly fired back with a thanks, but warned him that causality was yet to converge. Before he could ask for an explanation of yet another cryptic Skull Knight dialogue gem, Guru Gedfring arrived, and Guts realized that these two knew each other from a different time because of the way they spoke of each other. Gedfring referred to Skull Knight as His Majesty, and Skull Knight remembered him as Vid's son. The pair were clearly familiar with each other, but not revealing the full extent of said familiarity because they wanted Guts to discover something for himself. When he asked Gedfring how old he was, the Guru answered by telling him it was an irrelevant question for one whose flow of time was different. He inquired about Guts' association with Skull Knight and its inception, and when the swordsman told him it was a relationship he endured whether he liked it or not, Gedfring decided it was time they took a trip to the creator of the Berserker armor, the dwarven blacksmith Hanar. Skull Knight agreed, adding that it would be a good chance to fix the armor as well, so off they went. When they arrived at Hanar's forge, Guts started off by thanking him for creating the armor that had helped him sidestep death so many times, but Hanar brushed it off by saying he was the armor's owner now, and he didn't expect to see both of his most vicious pieces of work gathered in one place at the same time. Gedfring asked Hanar to give Guts a lecture on the nature of the armor, but Hanar is a more hands-on kind of guy. He wanted Guts to see for himself what would happen if he kept using the armor and didn't figure out how to master it, so he struck it with his hammer and triggered a blood memory, the memory of the day Skull Knight died as a human and started his life as a wandering wraith. Guts understood one thing from his entire experience, that he and Skull Knight were more alike than he thought they were, but that realization alone would do nothing for him if he couldn't use it to somehow defeat Griffith, and the peaceful nature of Elfhelm was starting to clash with his inner chaos. It was while he was doing sword practice trying to figure out his next move that his mind wandered back to Griffith, and Guts' frustration spilled forth. The journey to Elfhelm had been a success. Guts had managed to redeem himself by getting Casca a cure for a condition he thought was incurable. Casca was recovered, though her recovery came with a massive PTSD trigger warning every time she came across Guts. Everything had worked out for the best, so why did he still feel so restless? Guts tries to distract himself with the many positives he has in his life now, but his mind keeps wandering back to Griffith and his revenge. It's when he was thinking of how he can exact said revenge without losing what he'd gained in the process when the Moonlight Boy showed up out of nowhere, and Guts should have known that this kid showing up when he was thinking of Griffith was an ill omen. The struggler's peril and the rise of the Beast of Darkness. Will Guts recover in time? At first, the Moonlight Boy's visit to Elfhelm went pretty much the same way as most of his visits did, only this time, Casca was fully conscious, so things were even closer between the two of them. Guts too seemed completely fine, happy in fact with the Moonlight Boy's appearance because he knew that at least this kid brought joy to Casca where he couldn't. They spend a typical mother-son day together, playing with the golems and elves, fishing in the streams of Elfhelm, eating dinner together, and going to sleep in the same bed as always. The Moonlight Boy even gets a couple of reps in with Guts as he stick fights the Black Swordsman whilst donning the upper half of the Berserker armor. The reason no one suspects that anything wrong could happen because of him showing up is because 1. Shirker made him think that he was a manifestation of Danaan, which he wasn't, and 2. Even Danaan herself couldn't sense an ounce of malice from the Moonlight Boy's OD. His life force was so innocent, she claimed it was closer to her and the elves, and she could definitely tell this boy was no ordinary human child. Being the Flower Storm monarch, Danaan could also sense that the kid had a strong inclination towards Casca, of course, but also towards Guts, which makes sense considering the boy is their demon child in human flesh. Because time moves differently on Elfhelm, the Moonlight Boy ends up staying for a couple of days instead of his usual one, and in that time, Casca was trying to figure out just why she felt such a strong motherly instinct towards this kid. The realization came to her too late, because by then, the boy had been transformed back into Griffith, who immediately triggered what was the beginning of the end for Guts' sanity. Casca realized that the reason she felt so close to the Moonlight Boy was because it was her and Guts' demon child, but neither of them knew that child had fused with Griffith's incarnation vessel. So when Griffith appeared in front of them, the branded pair reacted in familiar patterns. Casca immediately broke down because the very source of her trauma had appeared in front of her. She passed out from the pain her brand was causing her, while Guts went directly at Griffith. The Black Swordsman couldn't believe what he'd just seen. The Moonlight Boy was actually the object of his hatred, hiding underneath his nose all this while. But he didn't lose his cool altogether. Guts tried to hold his rage back and attack Griffith while drawing the minimal amount of power he needed to move precisely from the Berserker armor, but it was still no good. He must have swung at Griffith at least 20 to 25 times, but none of his hits landed. They all seemed to just kinda miss him whenever they got close to him, and soon enough, Zod interfered because, of course he did. Guts ducked Zod this time though, because he had bigger priorities. As soon as the Immortal showed up, the Black Swordsman knew Griffith would be gunning for Casca, but just like the Eclipse, Guts was once again helpless in trying to save her. Griffith casually took Casca in his arms and after sending a shockwave through Skellig Island, flew away with Zod in tow. Guts crumbled at this point. He'd fought, bled, survived death each day to try to get Casca back. He'd been through hell, literally, and endured crimes against the human soul that no other human could probably even bear. He was hoping that he would have her back the way he wanted her back, and together they could end Griffith's tyranny. But he lost her to Griffith again, and he couldn't do jack to Griffith again. He'd lived his life by the belief that his sword was a part of him, and that while everything and everyone else might let him down, it would never. So you can imagine how soul-crushing it must have been for him, when that's exactly what happened, at the moment where it really shouldn't have happened. Maybe this is what Skull Knight meant by causality converging, because none of his warnings ever end well for Guts, and this is certainly one of those moments. But to see him not even try to fight off the dead spirits that were swarming towards him was a sight we never thought we'd see. Guts helplessly gazes into the sky with his arms stretched out because that's all he can do to stop Zod and Griffith from flying away with Casca. Not even a single stroke reached him. That's the thought that consumed Guts, and he survived another tide of the blood flow of the dead, practically on autopilot. When Griffith broke Elfhelm with his spatial powers, he released the island's original foundation and wanted it to consume the leftovers of the mages and beasts, if any. Someone cast a 4 Knights formation to stop that from happening, and Roderick's response to the realization that Elfhelm was in grave danger was extremely quick and efficient. All in all, they saved more lives than they should have been able to, but Guts was too out of it to realize any of that. He was carried to the Seahorse on a rescue boat by some of Roderick's crew, and Shirka was immediately summoned to help contain him because Guts just seemed, well, lost. Morda claimed that his look was vacant and he was mumbling something to himself underneath his own breath, and she reminded Shirka of what would happen if for some reason Guts unleashed the Berserker on the ship. Shirka took the clue and rushed to where Guts was in an attempt to get him to steal his mind and talk things through, but she was vehemently rejected entry by Guts' rapidly debilitating psyche. The Black Swordsman was in deep despair over the thought that the one thing that had defined his life had let him down in such fashion at such a crucial hour. He thought back to all his memories of war, all the times he lived because of his sword, and the thought made him so nauseous he fell face first onto the floorboards. Guts was truly powerless, and you could feel it. He wasn't able to move his body right. He couldn't even think straight. He'd lost all hope in his own strength after Griffith so casually destroyed everything he'd worked so hard for. All he wanted now was power, and that's when the Beast of Darkness rises from within him. Early on in his acquisition of the Berserker armor, Guts had cut a deal with his own malice. He'd keep it chained for as long as he was using the armor and only call upon it when he absolutely needed to. The Beast agreed, knowing Guts would reach his breaking point sooner than later considering what he was up against. And now that that time was here, it was reveling in his predictions coming true. The Beast is a manifestation of Guts' own thoughts, so it's like Guts having a conversation with himself in chapter 373. The problem is the content of this conversation because for the first time in his life, Guts craves power. He wants the means to defeat Griffith by any means necessary, and the Beast can taste it. When he taunts Guts with this fact, the Black Swordsman tries to rise up and grab his sword to put on a show of defiance, but he hallucinates Griffith standing on its edge, like he did so long ago, and ends up retching instead. The Beast simply proclaims that Guts can't deny his hunger for power, and leaves things open-ended by offering to give him that power should he yield everything to it. It stalks off into the night air as the Seahorse is boarded by Kushan warriors in service of Silat, Daiba, and, most surprisingly, Rickard. Turns out these 3 dudes had quite an adventure in Griffith's capital city of Falcon, and were now working together to try and bring him down. Them coming across Roderick's ship was most fortunate, because we're not sure what Guts would have done if it were anyone else. The Kushan boys rounded up everyone within the Seahorse according to protocol, and they chained up Guts especially because they'd been warned about him. Once again, Guts puts up no resistance, which breaks the spirit of his protege Isidro, and even baffles his one-time rival Serpico. Turns out he's in no condition to do anything because, for some reason, Guts is as incapacitated physically as Shirka was in that moment, and she was projecting her luminous body. Once Roderick got things cleared up with Rickard, everyone headed towards the Kushan's homeland to figure out their next move, and this is where Guts' story is right now, with Berserk going through the Eastern Exile arc. He's in the worst shape of his life, and we've seen Guts survive the Eclipse. He doesn't know what he should do next to protect the love of his life, and he can't even admit to himself that, yes, he does crave power. Maybe Guts will bounce back and become like his old self once he gets a bit of spicy Eastern food down his gullet. Maybe he'll end up going berserk once he regains consciousness and and kill all of his friends, followed by himself. Or maybe, just maybe, he'll end up using that behelit he's been carrying around since the first arc of Berserk and finally give in to his inner darkness. It remains to be seen which path Studio Gaga takes when it comes to his future, but with regards to his entire life before this moment, Guts is the authority on what a person can overcome when they believe in their own strength, and what happened when they lose that belief as well. He's come a long way since the traumatized cursed child that was picked up by a half-mad would-be mother on a whim, and based on the pace at which Berserk is continuing these days, he still has a long way to go. Marvelous verdict, but having said that, we're afraid that this is where we're going to have to end the video, because this is literally all that we've got on Guts' entire life. We've covered his traumatic early childhood to teenage years, his halcyon days with the band of the Falcon, his love for Casca and his enmity with Griffith, and all the ways in which the Berserker armor is set to ruin his life. We've talked about his many relationships and how they've shaped him, for better or worse, and we've given you all our thoughts on how we think this man's story will end, because it's still being written. But that's a lot out of us. What do you guys think? Do you want to see more such detailed documentary-style videos? Let us know in the comments down below, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep struggling, strugglers.